Hi folks, it's been a minute. I know this episode has taken some time to reach your ears, but this is the finale of our first miniseries together, and so I wanted to make sure that it was given the time, energy, and research it deserved. I've said before that this podcast is always going to prioritize quality over quantity. Hopefully the wait was worth it. One more thing before we get started. I've changed my setup and improved the quality of the audio, so if I sound a little bit different, hopefully better, you know why. With all of that said, let's pick up where we left off in our critique of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem, a mini-series by Darryl Cooper for the Martyr Made podcast. Installment 6 of this series picks up where the prior episode left off, in the middle to late 1930s in Mandatory Palestine. Right before we get there, though, Cooper for the umpteenth time starts us off by flipping through the order of events that led to the rise of Zionism in 19th century Europe. He refers to a quote from Theodor Herzl, the father of modern political Zionism. Quote, "If the Jews ever returned home one day, they would discover on the next that they do not belong together. For centuries, they have been rooted in diverse nationalisms. They differ from each other, group by group. The only thing they have in common is the pressure which holds them together." End quote. So what Herzl is saying here is something pretty obvious, that Jews, since being expelled by the Romans, have lived in the diaspora outside of Israel and have taken on unique cultural aspects that distinguish them from one group to another. There's Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews, Mountain Jews. That's a real one, I swear. Even communities that reached as far as China. It goes without saying that each of these groups are going to have idiosyncrasies unique to each of them. What's interesting about this quote, though, is that this is another one of those many moments we've had throughout this mini-series when Cooper is referring to sources where quotes are butchered in one way or another, or context is missing. In this case, the last sentence of the paragraph Cooper is quoting is omitted. Here's what it says, quote, "All humiliated peoples have Jewish characteristics, and as soon as the pressure is removed, they react like liberated men." End quote. That's important in material context behind Herzl's statement that's missing, because it adds a whole new layer to why Herzl is saying what he's saying. Herzl's acknowledging that divisions among Jews in the diaspora exist, but he's also saying those divisions look just like the divisions seen in any oppressed people. They are symptoms of humiliation, not permanent scars. Once the oppression ends and Jews regain their dignity, they'll act like any liberated people, like a unified national community. That's what he's getting at here. Cooper presents Herzl's quote as if he's diagnosing Jewish disunity as a fatal flaw. In reality, Herzl was diagnosing oppression as the cause of disunity, and Zionism, sovereignty and safety, as the cure. I mean, the guy wrote an entire essay called The Jewish State for a reason. It's clear where Herzl stood on the question of whether a country for the Jews was necessary. Cooper trims the quote in what may be an attempt at a gotcha, but it falls apart immediately, not least because Herzl's whole body of work argues the opposite of what Cooper implies. Despite this, Cooper presses on with the idea that Jews need an enemy, or an other, to rally against. He tells us that, quote, "You remove that outside pressure. What you start to focus on about your neighbor is not what you have in common, but what you don't." End quote. He's saying this in the context of how before the formation of Israel, Jews lived in different countries, spoke different languages, and, according to him, didn't really have much in common. In his telling, they needed an other to bind them together. He keeps building on this when he says, quote, "Without an other, societies, especially ones that are held together more loosely by a set of ideas or something other than, say, a shared biology, which you can't get away from, people start to question it and the boundaries start to shift and get a little bit more porous. When you don't have something out there to sort of provide that pressure that Herzl's talking about. In the 17th, 18th, and early 20th centuries, when the Christian aristocratic social order of Europe began to collapse and gave way to popular nationalism, new others had to be found to define the boundaries of these new social identities." End quote. So basically what he's saying is that Jews experienced heavy persecution as the social order of Europe broke down, and that because there was so much upheaval, societies looked at Jews as others. That persecution itself helped those societies mold their own identities by defining who was inside the group or national identity and who was pushed outside it. The 50,000-foot view Cooper is taking here is that Zionism came about because of this persecution in the modern era. That's a deeply flawed reading that strips out crucial context. It ignores the discrimination Jews faced long before the period Cooper highlights. We've already talked about Spain in 1492 and England in 1290, where Jews were expelled and their assets seized. These weren't unstable societies falling apart. England was consolidating under Edward I, who filled his coffers in preparation for war against Scotland. Spain had just finished the Reconquista, and Ferdinand and Isabella used the expulsion of Jews to signal unity. And Cooper's framing also leaves out Jewish experiences in the Middle East. We've already covered contemporaneous sources describing how Jews lived as a minority, often under restrictive conditions. Taking this all together, these examples undercut his claim. But the bigger issue is his implication that Jews need anti-Semitism to justify Zionism. That without persecution, there's no connective tissue holding Jews together, and that Zionism was invented to manufacture this. History tells us otherwise. After Israel's founding, the state took steps to rescue Jews far removed from Israel proper. In Operation Magic Carpet, Israel evacuated 49,000 Jews from Yemen. In the 1990s, during Operation Solomon, it airlifted over 14,000 Ethiopian Jews. Now, if you put an Ethiopian Jew in 1991 next to an Ashkenazi Jew in Tel Aviv, they might look like they had nothing in common. Different languages, different cultures, but both could read Hebrew. They celebrated the same holidays, and enough of a kinship was felt that one community trusted the other enough to travel thousands of miles to a new country, and the other made the effort to fly them there. In just 36 hours during the middle of a civil war, Israel evacuated thousands of Ethiopian Jews to safety. So, yes, persecution can sharpen an identity, but to say persecution is the foundation of Jewish identity or connectivity, that without it, Jews would have nothing in common, that simply doesn't hold. And yet Cooper continues to try to drive this point home. In the context of talking about Jewish immigration in the lead-up to World War I, he says that there are, quote, Jews from the Russian Empire who have come into these other countries. You've got well-assimilated German Jews. You've got Jews in the US, Britain, France, the Netherlands, some of those other countries who are very prosperous and very well built into their countries. And then you still got Sephardic Jews and Middle Eastern Jews spread out from Portugal to Iran, from there all over the world. Okay, so this is a very diverse community. End quote. He goes on, quote, "You're talking about people who had lived in different parts of the world for hundreds or even thousands of years, and when you drill down even more, you find Jews within countries and within communities split along generational lines or ideological lines." End quote. He keeps focusing on this point throughout the start of the episode, how different Jews are, how they speak different languages, how they're separated, divided, living in different places, and I think I know why. I can't read minds, but I think the foundation he's trying to build here is to try to convince the audience that Jews have more differences than similarities. As we just covered, those differences exist, but I think the strong emphasis on them here is intentional. If you convince people that a group has more differences than similarities, you break down that identity into smaller parts. Those smaller parts start to feel disconnected, and there isn't really one identity that binds them together. Think of it this way. Let's say you're making a smoothie. You throw in a banana, some blueberries, some yogurt, a splash of milk, you blend it all together, and you've got yourself a smoothie. It's all one thing now. The individual ingredients aren't really discernible. You're not drinking a banana, you're drinking a smoothie that has banana in it. But if you pull that smoothie apart, if you unmix it, if you deconstruct it back into separate pieces, you don't really have a smoothie anymore, do you? That's what I think is happening here. By emphasizing differences between these groups, the intended outcome is to drive home the idea that there's no connective tissue at all. They're so different, how could they be connected? And if they can't be connected, how could they possibly want to form a state? And if they did form a state, how could that state have any legitimacy? That's an extrapolation from Cooper's language, but I've noticed he's very intentional with his word choices, and words carry meaning and power. Cooper then takes us through a breakdown of the different Zionist leaders and the blocs they represent. He starts with Theodor Herzl, and he tells us how he was born in an Austrian home, which is correct. He was born in Budapest in 1860, which was under Austrian control at the time, and how all he wanted was to be an assimilated Jew, accepted by his fellow countrymen. He was secular, unreligious, and didn't even speak Hebrew or Yiddish, the Jewish lingua franca of Europe. He tells us how Herzl, quote, longed his whole life for that sort of full, seamless acceptance into Austria's Gentile culture, to just be a normal person in his society. He's trying to get away from that sense of alienation, end quote. He goes on to tell us that this all ends after Herzl is in Paris in the 1890s, reporting on the Dreyfus Affair, which, as we've covered previously, was when a French Jewish army officer named Alfred Dreyfus was falsely accused of passing intelligence to the Germans. That resulted in a series of show trials and anti-Jewish riots in France. Cooper then goes on to misconstrue what Herzl is saying in his seminal work, The Jewish State, with the following, quote, I don't want to say he attacks them, but he indicts his fellow Jews, laying out their faults as a people as a sort of incomplete and half-formed people interfering in the affairs of other nations. End quote. That's simply not what Herzl says. We covered this in episode 1, but given that we're covering it again, I'm going to repeat some of what we read there, so if you've got a photographic memory, feel free to speed this part up a bit. Herzl says, quote, the Jewish question exists wherever Jews live in perceptible numbers. Where it does not exist, it is carried by Jews in the course of their migrations. We naturally move to those places where we are not persecuted, and there our presence produces persecution. This is the case in every country, and will remain so, even in those highly civilized, for instance France, until the Jewish question finds a solution on a political basis. The unfortunate Jews are now carrying the seeds of anti-Semitism into England. They have already introduced it into America. End quote. He goes on to say, quote, we have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and to preserve the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so. In vain are we loyal patriots, our loyalty in some places running to extremes. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native land in science and art, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In countries where we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers, and often by those whose ancestors were not yet domiciled in the land where Jews had already had experience of suffering. The majority may decide which are the strangers, for this, as indeed every point which arises in the relations between nations, is a question of might. End quote. So some of that probably sounds familiar, but the main thrust of what Herzl is saying here is that as long as Jews live in the diaspora, they carry anti-Semitism with them, not because they're nefariously interfering in other nations, but because they have been subjected to discrimination since time immemorial. This isn't framed as meddling. It's framed as Jews trying to put down roots in the countries they call home, trying to contribute, trying to serve as loyal citizens, and being met instead with rejection, violence, and persecution. His framing of Herzl here is completely off the mark. This distortion continues when Cooper says that Herzl's Zionism, quote, all tied back to his original desire for individual acceptance. You know, if he was no longer an Austrian Jew from the diaspora living in somebody else's country, interacting with Austrians on that basis, but instead was a Jewish visitor from a Jewish state, just like an Austrian from Austria, then he thought he would finally be able to meet the people from the nations of the world on equal terms, end quote. This framing is an incredibly narrow and superficial read of what Herzl was trying to do. Cooper makes it sound as if Herzl's development of Zionism was born out of a Freudian craving for love or validation, as if it were a personal therapy project rather than a political movement. That interpretation degrades Zionism to nothing more than the remedy for one man's bruised ego, instead of a national movement rooted in Jewish history and lived experience. The point Herzl makes in The Jewish State is that Jews were persecuted in Russia, which was seen as a backward country at the time in Western Europe, but also in enlightened countries like France during the Dreyfus Affair. His conclusion was that assimilation was doomed to fail, no matter how hard Jews tried. Sovereignty was the solution because without it, Jews would always be viewed as guests rather than as fellow citizens. And here's the irony. Cooper himself adopts the same language of guesthood. In the last episode, he referred to the pogroms Jews experienced in Russia as indigenous violence. Or, put differently, the Jews weren't indigenous, the pogromists, ones committing the violence, were. That framing cast Jews as permanent outsiders, as guests, exactly as Herzl feared would forever be the case. So, no, this wasn't an ego-driven exercise for Herzl. Of course, his personal experiences shaped his thinking, but to claim that Zionism was merely about soothing his own sense of alienation is to ignore his explicit reasoning. Herzl said plainly, Jews needed a state because only as a sovereign nation could they ever achieve self-determination and break the yoke of otherhood. That was the logic behind his movement, and it's the logic Cooper's framing erases. Wrapping up Herzl, Cooper then moves on to Chaim Weizmann, who has been one of the main players in our story so far. Weizmann was born in a town that today is in Belarus, though borders in that part of Europe shifted so often in the 19th and 20th centuries that it can be hard to keep things straight. Cooper says it was Poland, and that's true at one point, but at the time Weizmann was born, it was Russian. He was also secular, leaned politically center-left, and was distinguishable from Herzl in what he thought the outcome of forming a Jewish state would be. Herzl believed a state would finally allow Jews to be treated as equals, a nation among nations, as he put it. Weizmann, by contrast, thought Jews would always be looked at with suspicion, even after they had a state of their own. As we've covered, Weizmann would go on to dominate Jewish Zionist advocacy outside of Palestine, particularly in the US and Britain. His prominence on the world stage was cemented during World War I, when he developed a new method of fermenting acetone, a chemical essential for Allied munitions, earning him both fame and political capital. Next up is David Ben-Gurion, born in Plonsk in what was then Russian-ruled Poland. He would come to dominate the Zionist movement within Palestine during the 1920s and maintain that control through Israel's independence in 1948, but we'll get there. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Unlike Weizmann, Ben-Gurion stayed in Eastern Europe and didn't go west for some time. Ben-Gurion was to the left of Weizmann politically, floating around socialist circles, and would go on to lead labor organizations in Palestine that laid the foundation for the political left in Israel. Cooper actually provides a pretty interesting juxtaposition between Ben-Gurion, Herzl, and Weizmann when he contrasts their different approaches to Zionism. Herzl sought to build an autonomous state under the umbrella of the Ottomans by working with the Sultan, initially. Weizmann pursued a realpolitik great power approach by working with the British to secure Jewish self-determination, and Ben-Gurion, meanwhile, was focused on building institutions and consolidating power directly in Palestine. At a high level, that framing is accurate. It captures their different strategies in broad strokes. Cooper then goes on to describe how in the 1930s, long after Herzl's death in 1904, there were three main centers of Zionism. London was Weizmann's domain, Palestine was Ben-Gurion's, and Warsaw was led by Zev Jabotinsky, the right-wing head of the revisionist Zionists. We covered Jabotinsky previously when we dove into his Iron Wall essay, where he argued that while peace and compromise with the Arabs would eventually be possible, to get there, in the short term, a militant iron wall of Jewish resolve was required. Jabotinsky was banned from Palestine by the British in 1931 as they considered him politically radical compared to figures like Ben-Gurion and Weizmann. He never returned after that expulsion, spending most of his remaining years in Europe, mainly in Poland. Jabotinsky and his right-hand man, Menachem Begin, would lead the revisionists in breaking with the centrist and labor Zionists in 1935. Unlike Ben-Gurion and Weizmann, Jabotinsky had no interest in working within the framework of British diplomacy. He believed Britain had already betrayed its commitment to the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which had promised Jews a national home in Palestine. Cooper goes on to highlight the divisions between the heads of these different camps, and it's true there was infighting between these leaders and their factions because of their different approaches to Zionism. Some examples of this include Weizmann losing his position as president of the World Zionist Organization in 1931, as many were frustrated with his conciliatory pro-British stance. In the aftermath of the Hebron pogrom in 1929, Ben-Gurion and those in his left-wing labor camp even referred to Jabotinsky on occasion as Vladimir Hitler, mocking the militant image of the revisionists. At the end of the day, they all wanted the same thing, a Jewish state, but the road to get there was what divided them. In 1937, we see the formation of the Etzel, or Irgun, a revisionist militant faction nominally tied to Jabotinsky, but with him banned from Palestine, it was really led by commanders on the ground. When it emerged, it became the second mainstream Jewish paramilitary organization alongside the Haganah, which had been created in June of 1920, in the aftermath of the Nebi Musa riots that April. The Haganah mainly aligned with Ben-Gurion's center-left camp, while the Irgun argued that a far more aggressive stance was required when dealing with the British and the Arabs. Reprisal attacks and bombings were their calling card. Without a doubt, the Irgun was more extreme than the Haganah. That's why they splintered off. In the late 1930s, Nazi Germany was rising and starting to bend borders in Europe, and many Jews were trying to get out of the way. Some of them, like Jabotinsky, see what's coming. He called it a volcano about to burst. Cooper refers here to a passage from Tom Segev, one of the historians he likes to cite frequently. In this passage, Segev is describing how Ben-Gurion was thinking about Jewish immigration to Palestine at the time. Quote, when in 1937 Ben-Gurion spoke of bringing 1.5 million Jews to Palestine over 15 years, he was thinking predominantly of the necessity to create a Jewish majority. Ben-Gurion also began to view the rise of the Nazis in Germany as a means to advance Zionism. End quote. Now, if you hear that in isolation, the impression is obvious. Ben-Gurion sounds like a pretty nasty guy cynically exploiting Nazi Germany to advance his cause. Some might even take it further and suggest, as Cooper does in the previous episode, that Zionism and Nazism had common ground, an argument we've previously broken down as the furthest thing from the truth. And you see the same framing here, the suggestion that Zionism and Nazism were somehow walking hand in hand, but the problem is that the next sentence from Segev is cut from Cooper's quote. It's a particularly damaging omission because it changes the entire character of what Ben-Gurion is saying. Cooper even continues quoting the very same paragraph after this cut, which makes the carve-out all the more inexplicable. Here's the sentence from Segev Cooper leaves out. Quote, we want Hitler to be destroyed, Ben-Gurion said, but as long as he exists, we are interested in exploiting that for the good of Palestine. End quote. That's a pretty material sentence to exclude. The difference between the two versions is stark. In Cooper's framing, Ben-Gurion looks like he's coldly using the Nazis to further Zionism. In Segev's actual account, Ben-Gurion is saying, of course we want Hitler smashed, but as long as he's there, we may as well try to get Jews out of Europe and into Palestine, which saves lives and furthers our cause at the same time. And it doesn't stop there. Cooper continues quoting this passage from Segev, where the next line is, quote, consequently, the Zionists took action to ensure that Europe's Jewish refugees would come to Palestine rather than go elsewhere, end quote. But again, there's another omission from Cooper here. Segev immediately adds this in, quote, on one occasion, Ben-Gurion told the High Commissioner that he would support the transfer of Poland's Jews to America or Argentina, despite our Zionist ideology if such a step were possible, end quote. The paragraph then ends with Cooper accurately quoting Segev's conclusion, quote, he, Ben-Gurion, saw other endeavors to help European Jews as harmful competition, end quote. So when you put it all together, the mid-paragraph cuts and all, Cooper's version makes Ben-Gurion seem like a man who only wanted Jews to come to Palestine to serve the Zionist project. And if Palestine wasn't an option to them, too bad, they didn't matter. But once you restore the two sentences Cooper leaves out, it's clear Segev is presenting a far more balanced picture. The Zionists hated the Nazis, they preferred Jews to come to Palestine if possible, but they were willing to see them go elsewhere if that was the only realistic option. The omissions matter. Cooper is selectively quoting in a way that chips away at Ben-Gurion's character, and by extension at Israel's founding story. Whereas in Segev's account, Ben-Gurion comes across not as a cynic or an opportunist, but as a realist faced with a horrific situation, trying to save Jews where he could while still advancing the Zionist vision. Over the past couple of episodes, we've highlighted how Cooper makes these pinprick remarks that sometimes aren't even the focus of the segment they're contained in. Their intent is to add to his narrative and framing. Despite his claims in episode 1 about letting us make up our own minds, it's clear that he has an opinion on this conflict, and that opinion bubbles to the surface when these comments come up. Here, Cooper is talking about diaspora Jews and the motivation behind political Zionism, when he then drops a flurry of claims that really have nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Here's what he says, quote, "You know, over all those years, European Jews had been chased out of over 100 countries, and very often it was due to superstitious anti-Semitic paranoia or some other such thing among the local population. I'm sure sometimes the reasons were a little bit more complicated, right? I mean, it would be weird if something was all the other side's fault 100 times out of 100. End quote. The talking point that Jews were expelled from over 100 countries is a hyperbolic statement that, as we've seen repeatedly, takes a kernel of truth and blows it up in the pursuit of castigating Jews. The point being made here is that Jews must have done something in many of the instances in which they were expelled, because to have been kicked out of so many countries so many times must mean that something is wrong with them. You see lists floating around online that contain these so-called examples, but scratch the surface and there's minimal substance in many of these cases. One list cites the 1550 expulsion of Jews from Genoa, Italy. Yes, it happened, but the reason was that non-Jewish doctors resented Jewish competitors taking their patients. They used their influence to get the Jews of the city expelled. So when Cooper says Jews must sometimes have been at fault, what he's doing is weaponizing the math. He's nudging the audience to think in terms of probabilities. If something happens over and over, maybe it isn't correlation, maybe it is causation. And that logic whitewashes centuries of religious and ethnic hatred into victim blaming. And Cooper doesn't stop there. He continues, quote, "When this is taking place, think back to the Middle Ages. This is a time when foreign hordes like the Huns or Mongols still randomly showed up on the horizon to rape all your women, take all your stuff, and kill all your men. And so people were very wary of outsiders, especially outsiders of another religion, when the political order of Europe was explicitly based on Christianity, especially outsiders from another religion who were supposed to have rejected and killed the founder of your own religion, and especially outsiders from another religion who were more than occasionally were not that shy with their hostility toward Christianity, and who had even collaborated with and even fought for Muslim armies that occupied Spain, and that were taking Christian slaves in Europe to sell to the Ottoman Empire. When you spell it out, you know, when you consider the times we're talking about, it's amazing that these Jewish communities were ever allowed to settle anywhere in any of the lands that were controlled by Christian rulers." End quote. Punch after punch at the Jews here. Let's break it down. First, there's Cooper's choice of language. He calls Jews outsiders from another religion. We've seen this before in his framing, like when he claimed Jews in Europe were subjected to indigenous violence, as we discussed earlier. It's the same pattern. Jews don't belong. It doesn't matter if they were born in that country or if they actively contributed to its economy and culture. They were outsiders. Then there are the claims themselves, that Jews were hated in Europe for killing Jesus, that Jews were hostile to Christianity, that Jews collaborated with Muslims in Spain, and that Jews trafficked Christian slaves for the Ottomans. Lots to break down here, and honestly, these comments could take up entire podcast episodes themselves, so we're going to address each of these briefly. On the first point of killing Jesus, everyone knows the historical complexity here. The Romans carried out the execution, with Pontius Pilate passing the sentence. This telling of events is verified by later ancient historians like Josephus and Tacitus. Both Jewish religious authorities and Roman officials opposed Jesus because in their eyes he disrupted status quo power dynamics, and the Romans frequently crushed movements that they deemed a threat to their authority. That's why Christians were massacred en masse for hundreds of years until Emperor Constantine's conversion in the 4th century. But regardless of that history, people in medieval Europe did believe that the Jews killed Jesus, and that belief shaped their prejudice. At the Second Vatican Council in 1965, the Church officially repudiated the charge of collective Jewish guilt for Christ's death. On the claim that Jews were hostile to Christians, this just doesn't hold water. Jews were a vulnerable minority in medieval Europe. They had no means of collective violence against Christians. Jews were massacred in medieval Europe, such as during the Rhineland pogrom of 1096, when over 10,000 Jews, or 50% of the region's Jewish population, were put to the sword during the First Crusade. On the claim that Jews fought for Muslims in Spain, Jews did have periods of relative stability under Muslim rule in Al-Andalus, but they were still dhimmi, second-class subjects, and faced brutal persecution at times, like during the Granada massacre of 1066 when thousands of Jews were killed. Historian Larry Simon in the UCLA Historical Journal addressed this myth directly. He wrote, quote, "There exists not a single source, Muslim or Christian, prior to the year 900, that contains any reference or even a hint of Jewish collaboration with the Muslim invaders of Spain." End quote. Quote, "One of the most persistent myths of modern historiography asserts that the Jewish communities of the Visigothic kingdom collaborated with the Arab and Berber invaders of the Iberian Peninsula in the year 711. End quote. Simon goes on to state that the earliest mentions of Jewish collaboration with the Muslims in Spain come centuries later from writers like Lucas of T in the 1200s, long after the events took place. And when Muslim chroniclers did mention Jews, it was only as civilians left behind after a city had already fallen, no different from Christian townfolk who stayed put. As Simon states, quote, "Their actions are obviously no more and probably quite less collaborative than the actions of Christian cities that capitulated." End quote. So, yes, Jews continued living in cities after they were under new ownership in Spain. The choice was simple: cooperate with the new rulers or face death. And lastly, the claim about Jews trafficking Christian slaves for the Ottomans. Here, the record shows something different. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, North African corsairs, the Barbary pirates, often operating under Ottoman suzerainty, did capture and enslave many Christian Europeans. Some Jews within the Ottoman world may have owned or traded slaves inside that system, but this wasn't a Jewish industry. It was an overwhelmingly Ottoman-run enterprise. Cooper's framing turns a massive Ottoman practice into a Jewish problem. That's simply false. It was this same Barbary piracy that led to the creation of the U.S. Navy in 1794. Remember the line "to the shores of Tripoli" in the Marines hymn? That's where this comes from. So when Cooper tosses all of this together, Jews expelled 100 times, Jews killed Jesus, Jews hostile to Christians, Jews helping the Muslims conquer Spain, Jews trading slaves, what he's doing is stacking half-truths and myths into a narrative of permanent Jewish culpability. Each point, stripped of context, becomes another charge to justify blame. But with context and a little bit of digging, it's obvious that there's very little substance here. And one has to ask the question, once again, what does this have to do with the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? The castigation continues when Cooper goes on to talk about the dynamics of Eastern European Jewry in the 1930s by essentially blaming Jews for perpetrating the Holodomor, the forced starvation of millions of Ukrainians between 1932 and 1933. He says the following, quote, "Ukraine had not been able to fight off the Red Army, and so in the early 1930s, Poland got to look across the border to Ukraine and watch the communist secret police, which was 75% Jewish in the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, murder by intentional starvation somewhere between 6 and 10 million Ukrainian peasants." End quote. It's another one of those pinprick remarks. So the background behind all of this is essentially that after taking power in the Soviet Union from Lenin, Stalin ordered the collectivization of farms, and the Ukrainian farmers weren't a fan of giving up their land and crops to the state. So Stalin tells the Ukrainians, guess what? You just got yourself an unreasonably high quota for grain production that you're never going to be able to hit, and oh look, you didn't hit it. So now we're taking your land, and your grain, and the seeds that you were going to use for your harvests. The communists seized all the food and the ability to grow it. And then in January of 1933, Stalin signed orders sealing Ukraine's borders so people couldn't leave to seek food. It created a cauldron of hunger. The idea was to starve the population into compliance, given that they had fought and lost a war for Ukrainian independence previously. So that's the context, but the real dagger behind what Cooper is saying here is that the Jews were chiefly responsible for this. The Soviet security apparatus went through many iterations, but in the early 1930s it was called the OGPU, short for the Joint State Political Directorate. This was the predecessor of the NKVD and later the KGB. Its chief at the time was Vyacheslav Menjinsky, a Polish Catholic. While it's true that Jews were overrepresented in the Soviet bureaucracy, Cooper's numbers are wildly inflated. Historian Boris Mironov of St. Petersburg State University published a 2024 article titled The Opportunistic Nature of Soviet Jewish Policy, stating that Jews made up 34% of OGPU leadership in 1936, falling to just 6% by 1939. That's nowhere near the 75% Cooper claims. Yes, there were Jewish officials who played a significant role in enforcing Stalin's policies. Lazar Kaganovich, one of Stalin's most trusted lieutenants, was heavily involved in carrying out the grain quotas, but to portray the Holodomor as a Jewish crime erases the central fact. This was Stalin's policy, enforced by a Soviet state machine that was staffed by Russians, Ukrainians, Jews, and others. By singling out Jews, Cooper both downplays Soviet agency and overemphasizes Jewish involvement, and frankly, all of this has echoes of the Judeo-Bolshevism trope that the Nazis birthed and promulgated. So we've definitely meandered a bit, but I'm just following Cooper's lead here. He takes us back to the outbreak of World War II in 1939, when Nazi Germany and the Soviets carved up Poland. Jabotinsky is in the US when this happens, and he dies soon after in 1940, but his right-hand man, Menachem Begin, is in Poland and is captured by the Soviets, and after spending some time in a gulag, is later released after the Nazis attacked the USSR. Back in Palestine at the end of the 1930s, the Arab revolt against the British had been crushed, and Cooper tells us around this time that, quote, Winston Churchill and many others were still all but taking orders from the Jewish agency, end quote. He's saying this despite the fact that in 1939, the British adopted a white paper that restricted Jewish immigration to 15,000 people per year and severely restricted Jewish land purchases in Palestine, things that the Jews were less than enthused about. This was done in an attempt to placate the Arab population after the revolt had been quashed, but the restrictions on the white paper continued to remain in effect after Churchill became prime minister in 1940. What's contradictory about this comment is that Cooper even says the opposite of what he just implied later in this same episode. Quote, the British were continuing to enforce the 1939 White Paper limiting Jewish immigration while the war was going on. You know, the way the British saw it, they were just fulfilling their obligations to the Arabs, but what this meant on the ground was interdicting Jewish immigrants that were trying to make their way into the country. End quote. So it doesn't really seem like Churchill was walking hand in hand with the Jews. If anything, it seemed like Zionist leadership was incredibly pissed off at the British for this. As we move into the 1940s, during World War II, aside from the threat of the Nazis pushing into Palestine from North Africa before Montgomery beat back Rommel at El Alamein in 1942, everything was relatively calm compared to the previous decade. Husseini, the head of the Arab Higher Committee and the lead political Arab figurehead in Palestine, had been exiled by the British for inciting violence in the region since the 1920s, and his networks had been suppressed. During the war years, around 30,000 Jews from Palestine would serve with the British Armed Forces and in the Jewish brigade they created, which saw combat in Italy in 1945, during the Spring Offensive, known as Operation Grapeshot. 700 of them were killed in combat. The surviving veterans would gain experience that would be pretty relevant in the next few years, which we'll get to soon. The different Jewish leaders that we covered earlier were all aligned initially on supporting the British while they were fighting the Nazis, and that meant that attacks on the British from the Irgun, which were ongoing, ceased for the time being during the initial years of the war. In 1940, we also see the Irgun splinter with a smaller group forming known as the Lehi, or the Stern Gang. The group was founded by Avraham Stern, and they split off from the Irgun because they felt that given the British were still limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine in the middle of the Nazis goose-stepping across Europe, they didn't think that attacks on the British should cease. They wanted to turn up the heat on the British in Palestine in the hopes of exerting pressure on them. The Jews just saw that the outcome of a multi-year revolt by the Arabs was a white paper that hit the Jewish community pretty hard, and they thought that maybe if they applied similar pressure on the British, they too could extract some concessions. That was the train of thought they had, and so Stern disagreed with the Irgun here and decided to begin attacking the British directly. It's worth noting that Leahy was very small compared to the other two groups, with the Haganah having around 20,000 or so fighters, the Irgun a couple thousand, and Leahy a couple hundred. To Leahy, it didn't matter that Britain was fighting Nazi Germany. In their eyes, the more immediate threat was Britain itself, the power enforcing immigration caps that were preventing Jews from escaping Europe and finding refuge in Palestine. In May 1942, Ben-Gurion was in New York, and the annual World Zionist Congress that normally happens in Europe obviously can't take place with the war unfolding on the continent, so the American Zionist groups host Ben-Gurion and hold a session that month to act as a kind of substitute. The meeting was held at the Biltmore Hotel, and the outcome of it would be known as the Biltmore Program. The program rejected the British White Paper of 1939, called for immediate Jewish immigration to Palestine, and notably, for the first time, called for the creation of a Jewish Commonwealth. Here's part of what the Biltmore Program said, quote, "The conference calls for the fulfillment of the original purpose of the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate, which, recognizing the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine, was to afford them the opportunity, as stated by President Wilson, to found there a Jewish Commonwealth." End quote. The program goes on to say, quote, "The Jewish people, in its own work of national redemption, welcomes the economic, agricultural, and national development of the Arab peoples and states." The conference reaffirms the stand previously adopted at the Congresses of the World Zionist Organization, expressing the readiness and desire of the Jewish people for full cooperation with their Arab neighbors. End quote. Cooper tells us that the Biltmore Program meant that, quote, "Palestine should be exclusive home of the Jews alone," end quote. But that's not what it really says, does it? That's not what national development of Arab peoples and states implies, nor is it what cooperation with Arab neighbors gets at either. Historian Benny Morris has a similar interpretation of this. He tells us that when Ben-Gurion adopted the Biltmore Program, it actually caused a split within his left-wing coalition, because some of his followers, quote, "refused to agree to the compromise implicit in Biltmore, that the state would encompass only part of Palestine," end quote. Or put differently, that mainstream Zionist leaders were open to compromise and the idea of partition with their Arab neighbors. Around the same time, one of the recurring names in our story, Haj Amin al-Husseini, comes into the fold again. The exiled Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and head of the Arab Higher Committee was in Lebanon when we last spoke about him at length. In April 1941, a coup took place in Iraq, supported by hundreds of Palestinian exiles, including Husseini, who was given stipends by both the Iraqi government and the Germans for his role supporting the rebels. This next quote from historian Benny Morris is a little long, but Husseini plays such a pivotal role here that I think it's important to lay out all the context. Here's what Morris tells us about all of this. Quote, "Once Baghdad had fallen to the rebels, Husseini issued a fatwa, a religious ruling calling by radio on all Muslims to join a jihad against Britain. But apart from some riots in Syria, he had little success in spreading the conflagration to the rest of the Levant. The British reacted with dispatch. Oil and vital supply lines were at stake. On April 18th, they landed troops at Basra and marched on Baghdad. At the same time, a mixed force of Arab legionnaires and British troops took the land route from Transjordan. By May 29th, it was all over, save for extensive looting and a pogrom by locals on June 1st to 2nd against Baghdad's Jews, in which 120 people were killed. Husseini fled to Berlin, where a foreign ministry spokesman greeted him as a great champion of Arab liberation and the most distinguished antagonist of England and Jewry. He had thrown in his lot with the Reich, even though Hitler had once called the Arabs half-apes. Amply financed, he was installed as one of the directors in Berlin of a new Arab office, whose function was to broadcast propaganda and mobilize Arab and Muslim support for the Axis. He also traveled to Yugoslavia and Albania to recruit Muslim prisoners of war for an Arab legion to fight alongside the Axis armies in the east. End quote. Morris continues, quote, "On November 28, 1941, al-Husseini met Hitler and promised to organize a pan-Arab revolt. And like the British in World War I, Hitler promised the Arabs post-war independence, as well as the abolition of the Jewish national home. Hitler apparently liked what he heard and saw, including Husseini's blue eyes. He said Husseini must have had more than one Aryan among his ancestors and one who may be descended from the best Roman stock. During 1943 to 1944, Husseini wrote to Eastern European leaders asking that they bar the emigration to Palestine of hundreds of Jewish children and adults. In a letter to the Hungarian foreign minister, he suggested that the children be sent to Poland under German supervision, end quote, so that the Jewish kids could be put under German supervision in Poland. I think you get the idea of what kind of person Husseini was, and how far he was willing to go to destroy Jewish life in Palestine before it even reached its shores. Now here's where Cooper steps in with his framing. He has this tendency to take a clearly bad person, event, or idea and try to soften it by equating it to something that feels less awful. We see him do exactly that with Husseini. He tells us, quote, "The Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestinian movement, did end up working with the Germans, driven by the same impetus that led many Eastern European states and countries like Finland to throw in with them. You know, for the Eastern Europeans and the Finns, if you've just been invaded and slaughtered by the Soviet Union and now the Germans are fighting the Soviet Union and driving them out of your country, you ally with the Germans, at least for today." Similarly, the Arabs were not particularly concerned with whatever was going on in Europe. They just wanted the French and the British out of their countries, and apparently some German with a military uniform and a silly mustache was fighting the French and the British, and great, he's okay with them. The alliance between the Mufti and other Arabs with the Nazis is hammered on endlessly by many pro-Israel activists today, but it really doesn't go beyond what I just said, taking sides with the distant Germans because they were fighting the British Empire that had been facilitating the occupation of your country by these hostile outsiders, the Zionists. In the early war, again, the Nazis looked unstoppable, and however things looked to us in hindsight, the people at the time had to deal with the reality as they found it. End quote. There's a lot going on here. First, this downplays the agency of Husseini entirely. Hitler wasn't just some guy with a silly mustache. This was Adolf Hitler. Husseini shook his hand, pledged loyalty, recruited troops for him, broadcast propaganda on behalf of the Nazis, and even visited a concentration camp. He made those choices, and he owns them. Second, Cooper downplays the depth of the actual relationship. This wasn't just taking sides, it was an ideological embrace, a handshake that was both literal and symbolic. Third, Cooper makes a very subtle move by comparing Husseini to the Finns. Everybody loves Finland. Even today, people associate it with snow, reindeer, and saunas. By lumping Husseini's alliance with Hitler in the same basket as Finland, Cooper tries to sanitize Husseini's role, but the situations couldn't be more different. Finland had just fought the Soviets in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, losing Karelia despite an effective defense that bloodied the nose of the Russians. Finland's goal was strictly political, recovering lost territory. Palestine, by contrast, was under a League of Nations mandate that gave the British legitimacy to be there. Finland kept its democracy intact, refused to sign a formal alliance with the Nazis, and refused Nazi demands to persecute its Jewish citizens. Husseini, on the other hand, eagerly moved to Berlin, pledged himself to Hitler, broadcast Axis propaganda, recruited Bosnian Muslims to the Waffen-SS, and lobbied against the rescue of Jewish kids by keeping them within the Reich's sphere of influence. Finland switched sides in 1944 and drove the Germans out of their territory, and even attacked German troops in Lapland. Their alliance was transactional, never ideological. Husseini, though, he drank the Kool-Aid. So in summary, these two relationships aren't equivalent. One was political, one was ideological. One was an alliance due to a convergence of belief systems, the other was in the pursuit of recovering lost territory that the Soviets had seized. Each had very different motivations, scope, and depth. Cooper then takes us into the Holocaust and refers to a few examples of survivor testimony that are gut-wrenching. One of these involves the story of Dina Pronicheva, a Jewish actress at the Kiev Puppet Theater. In late September 1941, the Germans ordered the Jews of Kiev to assemble, and over a 2-day period they murdered 33,771 of them in a ravine, the site of the Babin Yar massacre. Pronicheva was lined up to be shot like the thousands of others, but threw herself onto the pile of bodies and played dead for hours before crawling out of the heap and escaping. Her testimony would be key evidence in the January 1946 Kiev war crimes trials. Here's a passage of her testimony. Quote, "Each time I saw a new group of men and women, elderly people and children, being forced to take off their clothes, all of them were being taken to an open pit where submachine gunners shot them. Then another group was brought. With my own eyes I saw this horror. Although I was not standing close to the pit, terrible cries of panic-stricken people and quiet children's voices calling 'Mother, Mother,' reached me." End quote. You read things sometimes that just stick with you. Before Cooper shares examples like Pronacheva's, though, he has to equivocate the Holocaust with other wartime tragedies. He tells us, quote, "My goal here is not simply to emphasize the horror of the Holocaust, because we know it was horrible, okay? So was the rape of 2 million German women by Soviet soldiers. So was the starvation of 3 million Soviet soldiers by the Germans. So was the rape of Nanking and the indiscriminate annihilation of German and Japanese cities from the air by Allied heavy bombers." End quote. These things happened, and they are all awful. Millions of people died in devastating ways. All of these events deserve examination, reflection, and remembrance. But when you smash them together, as if they're interchangeable, you flatten them. Each deserves space on its own terms. Focusing on one doesn't erase the others. It amplifies them by giving them their own room to breathe. This reminds me of one of those moments when something bad happens to a place of worship. Let's say it's a synagogue, because as of the date of recording this in 2025, that's happening a lot lately. Let's say a synagogue is defaced or has its windows smashed. You frequently hear politicians come out and say, "We condemn anti-Semitism and racism and hatred in all forms." The ending there is really just a platitude. Reasonable people hate hatred in all forms, but you're supposed to be talking about the fact that someone just tried to burn down a synagogue. It cheapens the commentary because you're expanding the scope of it. It's okay to just focus on the thing at hand without needing to cast out a wider net. And yet that's what Cooper does here. Babin Yar is awful. It doesn't get much worse. The Holocaust was terrible, but so was the rape of Nanking, and yes, the bombing campaign against German and Japanese cities killed a lot of civilians. That last one requires further commentary at some point. Cooper never misses an opportunity to equivocate the actions of the Allies with the Axis powers. But that's a whole other story for another time. By giving each of these events room to breathe, you respect them. Smash them all together, and you do them all an injustice. If Cooper had left it there, in isolation, the commentary would be troublesome but perhaps recoverable. But then he takes it further. He says of the Holocaust, quote, "And you can tell that by the almost religious significance that this event has taken on throughout Western civilization, it has become a religious symbol, and what I mean by that is that it's looked upon as something without precedent, without cause, and to even inquire too deeply into precedents or causes will sort of draw suspicion. To look into the details of the symbol in a way that doesn't have official sanction. This can result in predictable social rituals of denunciation and predation, or if you're in many European countries, you can actually be jailed under anti-heresy and blasphemy laws. And we don't call them that, but that's what they are. The point I'm trying to make is if you're a Gentile out there listening in a Western country, you know the power of this symbol, the Holocaust, the power that it has over your own culture and society." End quote. Really a remarkable statement from Cooper here. The first issue is that he's implying that there hasn't been a tremendous amount of historical work or research done into examining the Holocaust. It's one of the most studied chapters of our collective tapestry in the history of the world. There's a tendency for a lot of influencers and pop historians to take this approach with audiences, and it goes something like this. The world as you know it is based on history that's been kept from you. It's been censored. The truth continues to elude you. If you'll just listen to me, listen to my twisted, esoteric, and ahistorical elucidation, then you'll know what's really happening. It's a method that jabs at people's psychology and makes them feel special. No one wants to be an outsider. Everyone wants to be a part of the in-group. This is what's happening in the commentary here. Cooper is telling the audience that they've been prevented from examining the real causes of the Holocaust. And he shields himself from criticism by being able to point to the harrowing examples of Holocaust survivors that he just walked through prior to these comments in the segment. The Holocaust is a monumental historical moment, but it isn't central to the lives of most people as Cooper is making it out to be. But there is a motivation for certain people to frame it as being more central than it is. If your position on Israel is that the country shouldn't exist or that its founding story is illegitimate, then you seek to chip away at that founding story and the motivations for the country coming into existence. The Holocaust is a big part of that justification. Jewish suffering reached a new ceiling in recent memory and was the straw that broke the camel's back when it came to living in the diaspora. Self-determination became a literal matter of life and death for Jews. And so, if the objective is to chip away at the founding story to further delegitimize the state, then subjecting the Holocaust to the influencer strategy we just discussed becomes a legitimate play. All of the other historians are wrong. There are legitimate reasons the Holocaust happened. The Jews weren't fully innocent. Maybe Hitler was misunderstood, or some variation of this. The end objective is the same often repeated phrase these days. I'm just asking questions. The questions, in these instances, are meant to overturn established history in the pursuit of furthering narratives that cast enough doubt in people's minds to impact how people think about these historical events. And when you frame this in a religious sense, in that questioning the proximate causes of the Holocaust results in one being branded a heretic, as Cooper states, this only reinforces the strategy further. See, look, I told you, if you even question these things, you're tarred and feathered and burned at the stake. What is it they're trying to keep you from knowing? Or something to that effect. That's what it seems like is happening here, and when you unpack the language and its meaning, it seems like there's a much more subtle, much grander strategy unfolding that's easy to miss if you aren't paying attention. We return to Palestine in 1942. Menachem Begin makes his way from Russia after being released from the Gulag early after the Nazis attacked the Soviets in June 1941. In 1944, he accepts command of the Irgun, and by this point, everyone knows what's happening to the Jews of Europe. Everyone is aware of the mass murder, and they've known for years. Begin announces that the ceasefire the Irgun had previously agreed to with the British is now over. He holds both the British and the Germans responsible. The Germans may be the ones pumping gas into the chambers, but in Begin's view, the British were the ones locking the door. And so attacks against British targets by the Irgun resume. Begin and the Irgun strike soldiers, offices, and infrastructure. He became such a nuisance for the British that they placed a £10,000 bounty on his head, the equivalent of more than $500,000 today. So now the two smaller paramilitary organizations, the Irgun and Lehi, led by revisionist Zionists, are taking swings at the British, while the left-wing Labour Zionists under Ben-Gurion are still sticking with the moderate track and holding the Haganah back from doing the same. Later that year, in November 1944, Leahy executed an assassination that would rock the Middle East. Lord Walter Moyne was the British Minister of State for the Middle East based in Cairo. He held the highest political office on behalf of Britain in the region, and was the chief implementer of policies pursuant to the 1939 White Paper. Due to this, Leahy felt that he was a legitimate target. Two Leahy fighters ambushed Moyne outside of his residence in Cairo and killed him with their pistols. Churchill was furious and personally pushed for the assassins to be executed, which they were in March 1945. The other Zionist leaders were outraged at Leahy and at their leader, Yitzhak Shamir. Ben-Gurion and Weizmann condemned it outright, but even Begin, who was perfectly willing to hit British targets in Palestine, thought this was a catastrophic overreach that handed the British every excuse to double down on the White Paper. This assassination triggered what would come to be known as the season, the hunting season, in which Ben-Gurion unleashed the Haganah against the Irgun and Leahy. Begin protested, but Ben-Gurion seized the moment to lump all the revisionists together and weaken them, even though the Irgun didn't participate in the assassination of Lord Moyne. The Haganah passed intelligence to the British that led to the capture of hundreds of Jews affiliated with the Irgun and Leahy. To Ben-Gurion, this distancing was necessary. If he didn't draw a sharp line between the mainstream and the revisionists, he feared the British would punish the entire Jewish community in Palestine and undo years of progress. The Jewish Agency even issued a searing public statement declaring, quote, "The perpetrators of terror who call themselves the Irgun and Lehi are traitors. They must be removed from our classrooms, banished from our workshops, and their propaganda, whether written or spoken, must not be permitted. The incorrigible despoilers must be isolated and abandoned, until they are spewed out of the ranks of the Yeshuv, until terror ceases and its organization is eradicated." End quote. That's a hell of a statement, and it sounded like there was no coming back from it. In total, close to 1,000 people affiliated with the Irgun Lehi and the revisionists were handed over to the British, many deported to detention camps. Begin's response was restraint. He told his fighters there would be no retaliation, no civil war. He had to plead with his own commanders not to strike back because he knew a Jewish civil war would be catastrophic. He also believed that in time the Haganah might come around to his way of thinking about the British. Lehi, much smaller than the Irgun, didn't share that restraint. There were occasional flashpoints, kidnappings, beatings, and even shootouts between Haganah units and Lehi cells. The season ended as Nazi Germany collapsed in 1945. By then it was clear that after the war, all Jewish paramilitary organizations would need to coordinate in the struggle against Britain. Begin's bet proved correct. In October 1945, the three groups, the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, signed the Hebrew Resistance Movement Pact, agreeing to carry out armed struggle together. The hunting season was over. Unity, at least for the moment, took its place. In July 1945, Clement Attlee and the Labour Party, in a surprise to everyone, unseat Churchill and the Conservatives. The promises of a welfare state with a new nationalized healthcare system sounded pretty good to a population that had just been through war and rationing. One of the comments that was seen as a faux pas in this election, which backfired on Churchill, was when he said that Attlee and his Labour opponents would need a Gestapo to impose their socialist policies on the country. Just an incredible line here from the British Bulldog. Attlee appoints Ernest Bevin as his foreign secretary, who took the position that a binational state governed jointly by Arabs and Jews was the most effective path forward, and he was staunchly against changing the immigration quotas of Jews to Palestine. This obviously flew in the face of what the Zionist leaders had been working toward for years, and they didn't take too kindly to this continued British approach in the aftermath of the war, which was to a large degree why we see the Haganah, Lehi, and Irgun signing that pact to work together in October of 1945. At the end of the fighting in Europe, the continent is ravaged, and many cities are, of course, completely destroyed. A non-governmental organization was founded called the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA. It was tasked with supporting the victims of war and managing some of the displaced person camps that had popped up throughout Europe. Sir Frederick Morgan, a British general, was pulled from active duty to lead this organization. Cooper quotes Morgan's writings when it came to the Jews in the aftermath of the war. He said the following, quote, "The whole business of illegally transferring Jews through Europe to Palestine was represented as being the spontaneous surge of a tortured and persecuted people toward their long-lost homeland. I fancy that in reality there were few among the travelers who of their own free will would have gone anywhere else than to the USA. To the world at large, the whole operation was presented as a spontaneous surge of survivors of hideous oppression toward the peace and safety of the homeland so long ago and so wickedly denied to them. Seen from among the participants, it did not quite look like that, except for a few ardent devotees with the light of fanaticism in their eye. I was never able to discover any great enthusiasm for the cause among the many to whom I spoke. All Jews were subjected to ingenious and ceaseless Zionist propaganda." End quote. So those words sound pretty damning, right? This is coming from a previously active-duty British general, who wasn't just any general, by the way. Morgan was previously the chief of staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, the planning headquarters that was created to prepare for the Allied invasion of Europe. Morgan's job was to draw up the invasion plans for Operation Overlord, D-Day, in June of 1944. This is someone that a lot of people know of and respect for obvious reasons, so him coming out and saying that the Zionist cause was manufactured among Jews in the displaced persons camps of Europe, people are going to pay attention to that. But there's more to this story that we'll get to soon. Morgan goes on to say the following. This is a bit lengthy, but it's important, so we're going to go through it. Quote, I suppose I should say, unlucky, in that I had, as it were, grown up over the past few years in the general international situation that now in 1945 existed throughout Europe. I was moreover by virtue of my cloth and calling in touch with the elaborate information-gathering network that had been built up through the war so recently ended, which enabled me to build up in my mind's eye a picture of events taking place around me that had very little appeal. All who have experienced it know the loneliness of high command, even when, as in the orthodox case, one is surrounded by a trusting and trusty staff. Here and now there was nothing of the sort, hardly an individual with whom one could trust information. On the contrary, there were many in my immediate entourage who could not fail to be actively implicated in what was nothing short of a skillful campaign of anti-British aggression on the part of Zion. There were several UNRWA camps exclusively for Jewish DPs, displaced persons, and refugees, of which it was never possible to get any accurate census. Their populations fluctuated by no perceptible system. These Jewish camps were, with one notable exception, in the U.S. zone of occupation. But the one camp in the British zone was near the site of the notorious Nazi horror camp at Belsen. This had been bulldozed out of existence as soon as its rescued survivors had been removed. The accommodation given to Jewish DPs and refugees consisted of first-class German army barracks, as good as any in Europe. But, of course, the name Belsen had tremendous propaganda value. When bogus complaints making play with the name became too insistent, the offer was made by General Templer, on behalf of the British Commander-in-Chief, of any alternative housing the inmates might care to select in all the British zone. The offer was at once refused, was moreover distorted into an attempt to inflict further hardship on these unlucky people, so Belsen remained for years as a staging post on the Zionist migration route and further was built up as the most efficient center of every other form of illegal traffic with ramifications throughout Europe and many other parts of the world. The camp near Frankfurt was used skillfully to reinforce points of Zionist propaganda, of which the general object seemed to be to indicate to the world that those Jews who had just survived the Nazi terror were now being treated little if any better by the Western conquerors who were now doing their utmost best for all, including Jews. If the propaganda at the moment alleged that Jewish DPs were being overcrowded in their camps, then the inspection would be invited and it would be found to be full to the rooftops. If the cry was one of starvation, the cookhouses would be found empty. If clothing were said to be short, then the population would be found in shivering rags, and so forth with consummate skill." End quote. So what Morgan is basically saying here is that in his opinion, the Jews were waging a propaganda war in the displaced persons camps using Holocaust survivors as props to appeal to the world's sympathies, in an attempt to presumably further the cause of forming a state in Palestine. That's my takeaway from this, and so it's clear from everything that Morgan was saying here that he clearly didn't think too fondly of the Zionist cause. These are some weighty accusations to be leveling here. But here's where things get interesting. On January 3rd, 1946, The Guardian published a few pieces on page 5 expanding on what Morgan had to say. The paper says the following, quote, General Morgan is reported to have said that although Jews now arriving from Poland all told stories of threats, pogroms, and atrocities, his representatives had not been able to find a concrete example of a pogrom inside Poland. What is also of importance, however, is the widespread fear of returning to Poland that undoubtedly does exist among Polish Jews in Germany. In the autumn, when the question of Polish repatriation from Germany was being discussed, only about 5% of Polish Jews expressed a desire to return, and many of these had some compelling personal reason, like the desire to search for missing relatives. The fear of returning to Poland is real, even if the facts do not justify it. If this fear can be removed, it will be an important step forward in dealing with a tragic and difficult problem. End quote. The Guardian goes on to interview Morgan, where they claim he said, quote, that he had seen an exodus of Jews from Poland on Russian trains on a regular route from Lodz to Berlin. All of them were well-dressed, well-fed, healthy, and had pockets bulging with money. All of them told the same monotonous story of threats, pogroms, and atrocities in Poland as a reason for their leaving. But UNRWA representatives have been unable to find a concrete example of a pogrom inside Poland. We can always get statements from Jews that there was a pogrom in the next town to them, the general said. And he was growing more convinced that the reported pogroms and atrocities of Jews in Poland are based less and less on fact. The stories, he thought, were the result of an organized plan to force the United Nations into taking action to give the Jews a permanent home. The organization to form Jews into a world force, a weak force numerically, but one which will have a generating power for getting what the Jews want, seemed to be forming in Poland and Bavaria. Some motivating force or promises are influencing Jews to give up comfortable living in Poland, which is proved by their physical condition, dress, and money when they arrive in Berlin. End quote. And lastly, quote, if the United Nations fail to undertake and solve the problem in some satisfactory manner, we will have the seeds of a third world war in our care and under the protection of the British, United States, and French armies, the general said. End quote. Something interesting about all of this, by the way, is that later on in this episode, Cooper states that the British public is getting a censored view of events in Palestine because, quote, what people did hear about it was mostly sanitized propaganda from Zionist-friendly news outlets like The Guardian, end quote. Doesn't very much sound like The Guardian was being particularly supportive of the Zionists here by giving space to Morgan's conspiratorial comments. So we have one of the principal brains behind D-Day saying that the Jews had nothing to fear in Poland, that they were imagining pogroms, that a dark and shady force was prompting the Jews to give up the good life out east, and that if the UN doesn't figure out what the hell to do with these Jews, then they're going to cause World War III. After hearing all of this, you really have to question where this guy's head was at when it came to how he felt about the Jews and Zionism, and whether there's some animus here, because it's pretty clear that he's not being an objective source of truth as Cooper portrays him. And this isn't just about his conspiracy theorizing either, he's just flat out incorrect. He says that the Jews were imagining pogroms. Well, we have records of these actually happening. One example of this was in Kielce, Poland in July 1946. 42 Jews were killed and 50 were wounded. This was instigated by a 9-year-old Polish boy named Henryk, wandering off from his parents' house on July 1st without telling them he was leaving. He returned on July 3rd and to avoid punishment from his parents told them that the Jews had kidnapped him. Polish civilians, police officers, and soldiers stormed the local Jewish committee building and attacked the Jews. Later that year, the Polish government charged a number of local officials for the pogrom, including the chief of police and his deputy. In the 1996 PBS documentary Shtetl, produced and directed by Marian Marzinski, there's an interview conducted with Yafa Eliak, a Holocaust historian. Eliak tells the story of how after the area her family lived in Poland had been liberated by the Soviets, her family returned home on July 14, 1944, after hiding in the farm of a local Pole who was sheltering them. The farmer told them to leave at night so that no one would see that he was sheltering Jews, because he would have been attacked by other locals for doing so. So the family comes back to their town, and some of the locals see them, and Eliak tells us that the locals say, quote, Hitler, after all, didn't do such a good job, end quote. That's the welcome they got. And her mother tells her father, please, we shouldn't stay here, and their dad tells him, okay, we'll leave, let's just rest for a couple days, and then we'll go. Rumors spread that the family has gold with them, and that Eliak's mother was going to reopen her drugstore, which had been shuttered. Well, the new pharmacist in town didn't think that was such a great idea. And so on the night of October 20th, 1944, while the war is still raging in Europe to the west, someone knocks on the door of the house the Eliak family is staying in, and then a grenade flew in through the window. There's an explosion and the shooting starts. Other Jews staying in the house with them make a run for it and jump out the back of the house, but her and her family decide to run upstairs and hide in a closet. Her dad drags a piece of wooden furniture in front of it to hide the entrance from the attackers. The family hears voices, and they recognize that one of them was the son of the pharmacist, and they're talking to each other saying the Jews ran away, and probably took their gold with them, until one of them says they should check upstairs. The family hears footsteps approaching, and one of the attackers blurts out that there's a scratch on the floor in front of the closet. It's fresh, he says. They slide the furniture out of the way and throw open the door, and now they're staring face to face with Yafa and her family. Her mom stands up while holding onto a baby boy, Yafa's brother, and calls out the pharmacist's son by name. They knew these people, and said to him, please kill me first so I will not see you kill my baby. So they shot her baby brother first, and Yafa counted the bullets. She tells us that there were 9 bullets that killed her brother, and then they shot her mother 15 times. Her mother fell on top of her and they kept shooting, but her mother's body blocked the bullets and Yafa didn't get hit. Her father was wounded but crawls out after the attackers leave, and while they're doing so, they're telling each other how disappointed they are that they didn't find any gold. So Yafa and her father go to the local Soviet authorities and speak to the NKVD, the secret police, and tell them what happened, and they give them the names of the attackers. They then proceed to bury her mother and baby brother in the local Jewish cemetery. They were the last Jews to be buried there. And as they're making their way to the cemetery, she recalls that Poles lined the streets and some of them were smiling at them and told them that they should have never come back. I don't really know what to say to that, other than that when you combine that testimony, and there are undoubtedly others that experience something similar, when you combine that testimony with the fact that we have other pogroms on the record, like what happened in 1946, you have to start to question how reliable Morgan is as a source and whether his bias is clouding his judgment here. Because he's making claims about the Jewish experience in Europe both during and after World War II that aren't grounded in any factual basis. So when Cooper cites this guy as some kind of appeal to authority, you really have to pause and question that. Cooper goes on to describe a point of friction between President Truman and Prime Minister Attlee when it came to Palestine. He refers to the fact that Attlee was trying to prevent a surge of Jews into Palestine so as to placate the local Arab population, and presumably Arab countries in the region that the British felt were of strategic importance to British interests, whereas Truman wanted to let in 100,000 Jews. Cooper tells us that Truman was doing this due to the impact of the Jewish vote in particular swing states during elections, and that may be true in part, but there's a bigger story here behind why this number was chosen and pushed forward by Truman. In 1946, the United States and the United Kingdom put together the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry. Their objective was to investigate the situation in Palestine with the Jewish and Arab communities, as well as the predicament of Jewish displaced persons in Europe. The committee was made up of 12 men, 6 British and 6 American. Between February and March of 1946, the committee studied the situation of the DPs in Europe and toured the Middle East. According to Benny Morris, quote, "The committee found that the Jews in Poland lived in an atmosphere of terror with pogroms an everyday occurrence. Indeed, Poles had murdered over 1,000 Jews since the end of the war. The testimony of American and British officials on the spot confirmed this, and most of the committee members became convinced of the need for immigration of the DPs to Palestine." End quote. So much for General Douglas's commentary that we covered earlier. Those pogroms were very real. Touring Palestine itself left an impact on members of the committee. Frank Idelot later wrote, quote, "I left Washington pretty strongly anti-Zionist, but when you see it firsthand what these Jews have done in Palestine, the greatest creative effort in the modern world." End quote. Another member, Frank Buxton, wrote, quote, "How my Vermont father would have been amazed at the greater deeds of the Palestinian Jews. I came away from those farms less cocky and more humble and not quite so certain that American pioneers left no successors." End quote. The main findings of the report were that the majority of the DPs in Europe wanted to settle in Palestine and that 100,000 visas should be issued and immigration expedited as rapidly as conditions will permit. That's where that number came from in the disagreement between Truman and Attlee. Notably, Cooper tells us the following about the report the committee produced. He says, quote, "A committee of inquiry that was sent by the British and Americans to look into the situation right around this time opened the report that it eventually produced by stating, 'Palestine is an armed camp. We saw signs of this almost as soon as we crossed the frontier, and we became more and more aware of the tense atmosphere each day. Many buildings have barbed wire and other defenses. We ourselves were closely guarded by armed police and often escorted by armored cars. It is obvious that very considerable military forces and a large number of police are kept in Palestine. The police are armed. They are conspicuous everywhere and throughout the country. There are substantially built police barracks." Back to Cooper here. Why are they so concerned? It wasn't because of the Arabs. The Arabs had been obliterated by the British from 36 to 39 and hadn't been really all that much trouble ever since. In the next paragraph, the report says, "We do not think that the conditions in Palestine since the Mandate have been fully appreciated throughout the world. It will be seen that up to the year 1939, the Jews exercised very great restraint. It is in recent years that the threat to law and order has come from them." End quote. We've talked about this before, how tensions started to bubble up after the Jews had been sitting on their hands. By this point, things were boiling over. But here's something worth pointing out. And I know some of you might think this sounds a little nitpicky, but it's not. Cooper claims this passage appears at the opening of the report. This is nowhere near the opening. The paragraphs he's quoting from don't show up until page 35 out of a total of 73. That puts them in the middle. Page 35, Chapter 9, Paragraph 1, to be exact. The section is titled Public Security. Take a look for yourself. The actual opening of the report lays out why the committee was appointed, which, to paraphrase, was to examine the situation in Palestine and the condition of the Jews in Europe. The first chapter is a summary of the committee's recommendations, and the second deals specifically with the Jews of Europe. By claiming the report opens with a description of a militarized Palestine, Cooper frames it as if barbed wire, police barracks, and armed patrols were front and center. They weren't. The report covers a broad range of issues: instability in Palestine, clashes between Jews and Arabs, and the activities of groups like Lehi and the Irgun. Cooper highlights the militarization angle, likely because it lets him segue into Jewish militancy. He follows this immediately by saying that the British buildup was necessary because of Jewish belligerency. Quote, in November 1945, about 1,000 Jewish terrorists launched attacks on railroad infrastructure all over the country. They blew up over 150 critical nodes. End quote. He then adds, quote, a few months later, in June 1946, the Haganah launches attacks on all 11 of the major bridges connecting Palestine to neighboring states, completely destroying 10 and severely damaging the 11th. End quote. To be clear, both of these events did happen. The first was the so-called Night of the Trains, November 1st to 2nd, 1945, when railway lines, stations, and bridges were targeted to paralyze British military and police movement. The second event, the Night of the Bridges, occurred over June 16th to 17th and shocked the British. Over the course of the 4-year Arab Revolt, with all the stops and starts, the British had never seen anything like this. The scale of coordination was beyond what they thought these ragtag paramilitary units were capable of. And this is seemingly why Cooper plays with the order of the report. By spotlighting these Jewish attacks as if they were front and center in the minds of the committee, he implies bad faith, that Zionist militancy was the reason Palestine had become militarized, not the fact that the region had been submerged in violence since the early 1920s. The report itself actually counteracts this framing from Cooper when it says, quote, the Jews in Palestine are convinced that Arab violence paid. Throughout the Arab Rising, the Jews in the national home, despite every provocation, obeyed the orders of their leaders and exercised a remarkable self-discipline. They shot, but only in self-defense. They rarely took reprisals on the Arab population. They state bitterly that the reward for this restraint was the conference in the White Paper of 1939. The mandatory power, they argue, yielded to force, cut down immigration, and thus caused the death of thousands of Jews in Hitler's gas chambers. The Arabs, who had recourse to violence, received substantial concessions, while the Jews, who had put their faith in the mandatory, were compelled to accept what they regard as a violation of the spirit of the letter of the mandate. End quote. What I'm trying to get at here is that this is a pattern that we see again and again. A timeline rearranged, a quote pulled out of sequence, a report recast as prioritizing something it doesn't. Something to ponder. A couple weeks after the coordinated attacks on British infrastructure, the British decide to exact their revenge to try to put the Jewish paramilitary organizations in their place, and so on June 29, 1946, the British launch Operation Agatha, what would become known as Black Saturday or Black Sabbath. The British swept through Jewish communities and raided buildings, searching for weapons and intelligence, and arrested around 2,700 people. The Jewish agency headquarters was raided, and trucks of documents were taken from the HQ to the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which was the British Army's headquarters. The destruction of this intelligence at the King David Hotel was part of the motivation for what would happen next. On July 22, 1946, Irgun operatives posing as milkmen carried large milk churns filled with explosives and placed them in the basement of the King David Hotel. Just after noon, the bombs exploded, killing 91 people, including British officials, Jews, Arabs, and others. Ben-Gurion and the Haganah condemned the bombing and distanced themselves from it and the Irgun, saying they hadn't participated. Cooper calls into question whether they really played a role or not. He thinks they did. The Haganah and Ben-Gurion were aware of and participated in joint operations with the Irgun and Leahy prior to the King David Hotel bombing, but for this operation, Benny Morris says this wasn't the case here. He says, quote, "Without coordinating with the Haganah, sappers placed a number of bomb-laden milk containers in the basement," end quote. Morris goes on to say, quote, "The Haganah, always opposed to terrorism, which it distinguished from legitimate anti-imperialist guerrilla warfare, condemned the attack, disbanded the Hebrew resistance movement, and called a halt to its anti-British military actions. Once again, each of the three Jewish underground organizations went its own way," end quote. Cooper contradicts Morris here when he says, quote, "David Ben-Gurion insisted that his people had no knowledge of the attacks. They knew nothing about it. They denounced it as a dastardly crime committed by a gang of desperados. Very convenient." End quote. So the question remains, did the Haganah know? There is evidence that a letter was shared between the Haganah and the Irgun, in which the former ordered the latter to attack the King David Hotel. But there's also evidence that suggests that the Haganah requested that the bombing be postponed. So it does seem like the truth is somewhere in the middle. They may have known about it previously, requested the Irgun stop, and the Irgun moved forward anyway, either because they didn't receive the communication to cease their actions, or because they didn't care. In the aftermath of the King David bombing, attacks on the British continued, with Leahy operatives sending letter bombs to British officials in 1947, all of which failed to kill or injure their targets. The British were getting tired of continuing to be targeted by the Irgun and the Leahy, and it began to wear them down. By 1947, the British are getting sick of the quagmire. They're tired of expending men and capital and energy justifying their presence to a British population that had just ridden out the Blitz and World War II. Nobody wants this. People are tired, and the whole point of all of this was to secure vital supply lines to India, and India's becoming an independent country, so why are we even here? In May of 1947, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, or UNSCOP, is convened after the British throw their hands up and say, "We need someone else to figure all of this out." Many historians actually acknowledge that despite the extreme methods employed by the Irgun and the Leahy, they were pivotal in pushing the British to the breaking point and pulling out. As Morris states, quote, "The Irgun's draconian methods, morally reprehensible as they were decisive in this," end quote. The committee itself was composed of 11 representatives, drawn from a range of countries: Australia, Canada, Czechoslovakia, Guatemala, India, Iran, the Netherlands, Peru, Sweden, Uruguay, and Yugoslavia. Cooper criticizes the lack of Arab representation on the committee, but I don't find that to be problematic. There wasn't any Jewish representation either, and frankly, you'd expect an impartial fact-finding body not to include partisans from either side of the conflict. So I'm not sure why he singles this out as being an issue. The committee arrived in Palestine in June 1947, and much like the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, the year before they toured the country and heard testimony from Jewish and Arab communities. By August 1947, UNSCOP presented its report to the UN with two options. The majority plan called for partition: 2 independent states, 1 Arab and 1 Jewish, with Jerusalem and Bethlehem placed under international administration. This was supported by Canada, Czechoslovakia, Guatemala, the Netherlands, Peru, Sweden, and Uruguay. The minority plan proposed a single federal state with 2 self-governing provinces, 1 Arab and 1 Jewish, and Jerusalem as its capital. This was supported by Iran, India, and Yugoslavia. Australia abstained, arguing that the mandate should continue until the two sides could work things out themselves. Come on, Australia. Get off the fence, guys. And so the majority opinion is the one that's put before the United Nations for a General Assembly vote under what would come to be called UN Resolution 181, a partition plan for Palestine. And this is one of those rare moments, really one of the few moments in the aftermath of World War II where the US and Soviets actually agreed on something. Both countries wanted the partition plan to move forward for different reasons. Truman was supportive of the Zionist cause and was close with Weizmann, and wanted to capture the Jewish vote, whereas Stalin saw this as an opportunity to increase Soviet influence in the Middle East. Ben-Gurion and his left flank, many of them embraced socialism, and Stalin thought that maybe he'd be able to bring the Israelis into the Soviet sphere of influence. When you read the resolution itself, it has an incredibly detailed breakdown, paragraph after paragraph, explaining where the border of each state was going to be. It gets really granular. I'm not going to bore you with all of it, but I think getting a flavor for how detailed this is would be helpful. I'm going to read you a snippet of it, and I'm warning you, I'm going to butcher some of this pronunciation. Quote, "The northern boundary of the Arab section of the coastal plain runs from a point between Minat el-Kila and Nabi Yunus, passing between the built-up areas of Gan Yavni and Barka to the point of intersection. From here, it turns southwestward, running across the lands of Julius, leaving the built-up areas of Batani Sharki and Julius to the westwards." End quote. So you get the gist of how dense this thing is. But the end result of this is that the Arabs basically got the West Bank, Gaza, and a strip of land that extended into the Negev desert, as well as portions of the north and central Galilee in the north, with the Jews getting the coastal plain from Haifa to Ashdod, the rest of the Negev, and a strip in the north adjacent to the Golan Heights. In the end, the Jews were to be given 55% of Palestine, with a population of 500,000 Jews and 400,000 Arabs. They were ecstatic about this. The Arabs were to get the remaining 45%, with 725,000 Arabs and 10,000 Jews. Jerusalem, which was to be put under international control, had roughly 100,000 Jews and another 100,000 Arabs. Now, for the resolution to pass in the UN General Assembly, a two-thirds majority was needed, and Cooper points out correctly that there was some arm-twisting in getting to this majority. A major lobbying effort was launched by the US and the Zionists to get countries to vote for the resolution. Greece was threatened with a foreign aid cutoff, and Liberia with a rubber embargo after they had initially indicated they were planning on voting this down. The Philippines was also subjected to this. It should have been clear at this point that Stalin's notion that a Jewish state was definitely going to shift into the Soviet sphere had little chance of succeeding, given how pivotal US involvement at the UN was for the resolution vote, but that's a whole other subject. It's in this moment where Cooper quotes from an Arab delegate who says the following, quote, "The Arabs of Palestine are not responsible in any way for the persecution of the Jews in Europe. That persecution is condemned by the whole civilized world, and the Arabs are among those who sympathize with the persecuted Jews. However, the solution of that problem cannot be said to be a responsibility of Palestine, which is a tiny country and which had taken enough of those refugees, and other people since 1920. Any delegation which wishes to express its sympathy has more room in its country than has Palestine, and has better means of taking in these refugees and helping them." End quote. I think this is a revealing quote, because it's emblematic of what a lot of Arab leaders were thinking at the time. In their minds, they didn't want the Jews in Palestine. Someone else could take them in. They weren't offering themselves, mind you, but someone else could take care of it. But even deeper than this is the lack of understanding of what this was all about. It wasn't about finding somewhere or anywhere to live. It wasn't about immigration. It was about self-determination and sovereignty. That's not something that can be achieved by just becoming a citizen somewhere else. The Jews had learned how quickly the value of a passport can dissipate. Abba Eban, who would later become Israel's ambassador to the UN and then its foreign minister, wrote in his autobiography an account of events leading up to the UN vote. Here's how he characterized the moment. Quote, "Once again, we were helped by Arab obduracy. The Arab states, spurred by the Arab Higher Committee, urged total rejection of UNSCOP's report in both parts. The only solution which they would consider would be the establishment of an Arab state in which the existence of a separate Jewish nationality would be ignored. It should have been obvious from the start that any proposal which disregarded the existence of a Jewish nationhood was now internationally unacceptable. All the world tribunals had regarded Jewish immigration to Palestine as a matter of right and urgency, so in submitting extreme demands, the Arabs strengthened the impression that the Jews needed powerful safeguards to defend their existence and their very lives." End quote. When the day of the vote came on November 29, 1947, 33 countries voted yes, 13 no, and 10 abstained. The nays were made up of Arab and Muslim states, Cuba, and India, and the ayes were comprised of the US, British Commonwealth countries, Western Europe, the Soviet bloc, and most of Latin America. Britain, Argentina, Mexico, Chile, and China were among those who abstained. The Arab delegates stormed out of the room and made it clear that any effort to implement the resolution would lead to war. Morris sheds light on this moment. Quote, "When the Arabs walked out of the General Assembly declaring that partition would lead to war, it was not an idle threat. In June 1946, the Arab League had secretly pledged funds, arms, and volunteers to the Palestinians. On September 16, 1947, the League decided to establish an Arab Liberation Army, the ALA, comprised of Palestinians and volunteers from Arab states. In November, the Syrian army began registering volunteers and set up a training camp." End quote. The Arab League was made up of, you guessed it, regional Arab nations, and they set up a military committee that was headed by the former head of the Iraqi army, General Safwat. The general made it known to the member states of the League that if they didn't mobilize and aid the Palestinians, the Zionists would win. Husseini is the political leader of the Palestinians at the time, and he's not really thrilled about the League's discussions on armed intervention. On the one hand, he wants the Jews pushed into the sea, but on the other hand, he thinks that the other Arab countries might be making a play for more territory and seizing land from him. He was justifiably concerned. And so with all of this unfolding, Cooper tries to paint a picture for us of the Zionists increasing their militarization over the years in anticipation of this moment of international recognition of a Jewish state. He refers to Chaim Weizmann's autobiography and his comments on how he felt the nature of the Jewish state was changing when he visited in 1944, just a few years before the partition vote. He quotes Weizmann as saying the following, quote, "Here and there, a relaxation of the old traditional Zionist Puritan ethics, a touch of militarization, and a weakness for its trappings. Here and there is something worse, the tragic, feudal, un-Jewish resort to terrorism, and worst of all in certain circles, a readiness to compound with the evil, to play politics with it, to condemn and not to condemn it, to treat it not as the thing it was, namely an unmitigated curse to the national home, but as a phenomenon which might have its advantages." End quote. He's referring to the actions of the Irgun and Leahy here. The revisionists always operated antithetically to the way Weizmann wanted to do things. There's two massive problems with the way Cooper recites this quotation from Weizmann. The first issue is that Cooper is omitting the opening sentence of this quote that's connected to what Weizmann is saying with a colon, which is pretty egregious because this is a mid-sentence cut that provides a bunch of preceding context behind what Weizmann is saying here. The bit that Cooper omits that provides this context is on page 438 and 439 of Weizmann's autobiography, titled Trial and Error. Quote, "Side by side with these developments, in some ways linked with them, and in part arising from their bitter frustration and legitimate hopes, there were negative features I have referred to." End quote. So what are the developments that Weizmann is referring to? I'm glad you asked, because the second major issue with Cooper's recitation is that there's a whole paragraph before all of this that sets the stage for Weizmann's criticism of the revisionists and the way they conducted themselves. Taken in isolation, Cooper's quotation of Weizmann makes it seem as though the guy that would later become Israel's first president really didn't have all that much good to say about the place. When you include the preceding paragraph, there's a lot more context behind what he goes on to say. Here's the paragraph immediately preceding all of this. Quote, "The reception accorded to me by the Jews of Palestine after my absence of more than 5 years was warm, generous, and spontaneous. It was a wonderful homecoming, all that the heart could wish, or rather, it would have been if there had not been certain phenomena which caused me grave concern. Since 1939, the homeland had undergone great changes, and once at least, when Rommel stood at Al Alamein, it had passed through the valley of the shadow of death. There had been moments when a frightful premonition of ultimate disaster had haunted us, and we had had nightmares of the Germans and Italians marching into Palestine, and our cities and colonies, the tenderly nurtured achievements of 2 generations, given over to the same pillage and destruction as German and Polish Jewry. It had not happened, and the homeland had come through stronger than ever. The war years had knit the community into a powerful, self-conscious organism, and the Great War effort, out of all proportion to the numerical strength of the Yishuv, had given the Jews of Palestine a heightened self-reliance, a justified sense of merit and achievement, a renewed claim on the democratic world, and a high degree of technical development. The productive capacity of the country had been given a powerful thrust. The national home was in fact here, unrecognized, and by that lack of recognition frustrated in the fulfillment of its task. Here were over 600,000 Jews capable of vast concerted action on behalf of the remnant of Jewry in Europe, them no impersonal element, but in thousands of instances composed of near and dear ones. capable of such action, frantically eager to undertake it and forbidden to do so." End quote. So when you combine that with what Cooper does tell the audience, there's a much fuller and balanced picture with how he's thinking about the development of his country. He's referring to the rising militancy in the context of European Jewry getting almost entirely wiped out, while the Jews in Palestine for a time thought that Rommel was going to bring upon them the same fate, and that these experiences unified the country, brought it together, and allowed it to weaponize its frustrations in the pursuit of its national struggle and development. He doesn't shy away from the negative aspects and behavior that have come alongside this, which is what Cooper chooses to highlight, but he does provide a more holistic picture of the facts on the ground compared to how Cooper tees this up. What Cooper seems to be doing here is trying to weaponize Weitzman's words to chip away at the founding story of Israel. By truncating quotes and not providing the full context, it gives the appearance of Weitzman shifting his position on Zionism and Israel, when in reality he's voicing his concerns in a balanced way, not turning his back on his cause. As stated, Weitzman would go on to become the president of the country for a reason, so while there was clearly a divide between him and the methods employed by the political right and the revisionists, he didn't abandon Israel. Getting back to our timeline here, the violence erupted immediately after the passing of UN Resolution 181, and what happens next can really be broken out into two phases. The first phase, for lack of a better term, is a civil war in Palestine, which lasted from December 1947 to May 1948. The second phase comprised a conventional war between the Israelis and the invading armies of Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and small expeditionary forces from other countries, including Yemen and Saudi Arabia. This second portion lasted from May 15, 1948 until early 1949. During the first phase, the majority of fighting occurred in areas marked out in the UN partition plan for the Jewish state, and bear in mind, while this is happening, the British are still in the country, trying to make sure that things don't blow up to the point that they're unable to extricate themselves, which they finally did on May 15, 1948. The first Civil War phase itself can be further divided into two periods. The first from December 1947 to March 1948, during which the Arabs held the initiative and the Haganah remained largely in a defensive position. And then from early April 1948, when the Haganah went on the offensive and by mid-May had crushed local Palestinian resistance. During this first period of the Civil War, main roads were largely controlled by Arab irregulars, which placed the largely Jewish West Jerusalem in an incredibly difficult spot. Convoys were ambushed along the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road, and the city was essentially under siege, with food and water in short supply. The first organized armed attack on a Jewish urban center occurred on December 8, 1947, against a neighborhood in Tel Aviv. Amidst all of this, you have bombs going off on both sides targeting civilians, the Irgun and Leahy planting bombs in markets killing Arabs, and Arab irregulars doing the same in public spaces where Jews gathered. Grand Mufti Husseini's chief bomb maker, Fazi al-Qutb, learned how to put together explosives in a course he took while in Nazi Germany that was taught by the SS. That expertise was put to use here. On December 30th, 1947, the Irgun threw bombs into a crowd at a bus stop outside the Haifa oil refinery, which killed 6 people. Arab workers inside the refinery then turned on their Jewish co-workers with hammers and clubs, and massacred 39 of them before the British intervened and put a stop to the bloodshed. This SS-trained bomb maker, Qutb, he got together a few stolen trucks and an armored car and handed them over to 6 British deserters who sided with the Arabs. On February 22, 1948, they drove these trucks packed with explosives into the heart of Jewish Jerusalem and blew them up. They destroyed 4 buildings and killed 58 people. And as all of this is happening, the Haganah is desperately trying to get into West Jerusalem from the outside to reinforce the defenders and resupply them. But throughout March, they kept losing their convoys and crack troops to Arab irregulars, firing on them, and preventing them from getting into the city. There's a record of some Haganah crack troops in one of these armored columns. Their vehicle was damaged and their comrades had retreated. They blew themselves up in their armored car because they knew that if they fell into enemy hands, they would have been put to death and mutilated by their captors. So this is as messy as you could possibly imagine. Everything is turning upside down. The region is on fire. Imagine chaos, just total chaos, and then crank that up to 10. And that's basically what's happening here. Going into April of 1948, the Haganah starts getting its first major arms shipments from Czechoslovakia, and these shipments completely shifted the calculus. The British and the US had placed arms embargoes on shipments to the region. Neither the Jews or the Arabs were getting arms from either country, so these infusions of material were vital. Now the Haganah feels it's ready to switch over to the offensive. It's here that Cooper really starts talking about hostilities in 1948 without really covering any of the build-up leading to this point. He starts off by talking about Plan D, which was an operational plan created by the Haganah. Here's how he describes it, quote, "In March 1948, 2 months before the British Union Jack was to be folded up and sent back to Britain with the last British official, the Haganah prepared Plan D. The British evacuation had been proceeding very slowly up to this point, but was about to pick up speed. They were going to leave very quickly, and Plan D was to come into force once the Zionists determined that there were too few British forces left in the country to stop them from carrying it out. Under Plan D, the Haganah would act quickly and decisively and independently to secure not only the territory that had been designated as the Jewish partition by the UN, but that they would strike out an Arab territory anywhere that a few Jews lived, or to seize any land that they determined was necessary to secure and defend what they already held." End quote. Cooper gets some of this right, but his framing is totally off. The point of Plan D was to secure supply lines, given that the roads had been under Arab control from the beginning of the war, and West Jerusalem was on the verge of starvation. Its secondary objective was to secure the border regions around Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, because Haganah intelligence knew that the conventional Arab armies were going to be invading as soon as the British got out of Dodge. Were Arab villages attacked throughout Plan D? Yes. They were. Some of them were destroyed and their inhabitants kicked out, but many villages were also left in place, and it's the descendants of these people that make up the 20% or so of Israel's modern population that identifies as Arab. The motivation behind the plan wasn't expulsion. It was dealing with the practical reality that come May, the war was about to take on an entirely different character. Here's how Benny Morris characterizes Plan D. I'm telling you now, since I'm such a stickler for quoting sources, that I'm going to jump around here a little bit, so I'm quoting verbatim but not necessarily in sequential order. Okay? Okay. Quote, "The loss of convoys prompted a decisive switch in Haganah strategy. If the Arab bands could not be defeated on the roads, the Haganah would have to destroy them in their bases by attacking and conquering Arab villages and districts. Only thus could the pressure on embattled Jewish neighborhoods and settlements be permanently relieved." The switch to the offensive in early April also had a political trigger. By mid-March, the international community was beginning to entertain second thoughts about the partition resolution of November 1947. Given the state of the Yishuv after their terrible losses along the roads, it had no choice. Either it went on the offensive or it would lose Jewish Jerusalem and perhaps the war. The plan was to have been set in motion in May, as the last British troops were withdrawing. Its aim was to take over strategic areas vacated by the British, gain control of the main towns and internal lines of communication, and secure the emergent states' border areas in preparation for the expected invasion by the Arab armies. Implementation, in effect, meant crushing the Palestinian Arabs' military power and subduing their urban neighborhoods and rural settlements in the areas earmarked for Jewish statehood. Blocks of settlements outside the statehood areas were also to be secured and linked up. End quote. So that's kind of the high-level objective here, and that's taken from Morris's book Righteous Victims, but he has his other book called 1948 where he provides a really great breakdown of this war on a granular level. He dives into the different operations in different regions, and you can see what happened in a specific zone of the conflict. And so he tells us that Plan D really kicked off with an attempt to secure Jewish Jerusalem, which was codenamed Operation Nashon. The Haganah puts together 1,500 men into an armored convoy and conducts the modern equivalent of a thunder run heading toward Jerusalem. He tells us that the Jewish leaders, quote, understood that they would first have to crush the Palestinian militias in the main towns and along the main roads and the country's borders if they were to stand a chance of beating off the invading armies, and that the Palestinians would have to be defeated in the 6 weeks remaining before the British departure, scheduled for May 15th, end quote. He continues, quote, "For 4 months under continuous Arab provocation, the Yishuv had largely held itself in check. Initially in the hope that the disturbance would blow over, and later in deference to international, particularly British, sensibilities." End quote. And lastly, Morris gives us the following, quote, Plan D has given rise over the decades to a minor historiographic controversy with Palestinian and pro-Palestinian historians, charging that it was the Haganah's master plan for the expulsion of the country's Arabs. But cursory examination of the actual text leads to a different conclusion. The plan calls for securing the emergent state's territory and borders and the lines of communication between the Jewish centers of population and the border areas. End quote. So that's all some pretty important context, I would say, and it's odd for Cooper to omit a lot of this context when covering both Plan D and the lead-up to it in 1947 and 1948, given how frequently he cites Benny Morris. The outcome of the Thunder Run was partially successful in that desperately needed supplies and reinforcements were able to get into West Jerusalem, but the road would remain largely shut by Arab forces after this until late May to June, when an alternate route was constructed around Arab defenses. It's during this initial opening salvo of Plan D through Operation Nishon that we see an episode that has drawn serious historical scrutiny, and deservingly so. On April 9, 1948, the Irgun and Lehi approached the village of Deir Yassin, an Arab town on the road between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. I'll turn to Morris again to explain what happens next. Quote, about 120 men advanced on the village from the western edge of Jerusalem in 2 columns, with a van carrying a bullhorn between them. The van blared a message calling on the villagers to put down their weapons and flee, but the van quickly overturned in a ditch. The villagers may have not heard the broadcasts. As the attackers moved in, they encountered unexpectedly strong fire from the village's stone houses and were repeatedly pinned down. End quote. He continues, quote, Irgun and Lehi troopers moved from house to house, lobbing in grenades and spraying the interiors with small arms fire. They blew up houses and sometimes cut down those fleeing into alleyways, including 1 or 2 families. The operation lasted into late afternoon. The attackers suffered 4 dead and several dozen wounded, including the operation's commander. End quote. Cooper says that at the end of all of this, 245 people were killed at Deir Yassin. Morris takes issue with this figure. Quote, 100 to 120 villagers, including combatants, died that day, although Irgun, Haganah, and Arab officials and the British almost immediately inflated the number to 254 or 245, each for their own propagandistic reasons. End quote. Regardless of the exact number, it's clear that a significant number of civilians were killed alongside combatants, and the whole episode became a rallying cry for the Palestinian cause. Even though the Jewish Agency, the Haganah Command, and the 2 chief rabbis of the Jewish community in Palestine all condemned the attack, it wasn't enough. Arab media seized the opportunity to inflame public opinion and increase pressure on Arab governments to intervene militarily. As Morris tells us, quote, in the weeks after the massacre, Arab media inside and outside Palestine continuously broadcast reports about the atrocities, usually with blood-curdling exaggerations in order to rally Arab public opinion and governments against the Yishuv. Without doubt, they were successful. The broadcasts fanned outrage and reinforced the Arab government's resolve to invade Palestine 5 weeks later. End quote. The Arabs took their revenge on a 10-vehicle convoy carrying mostly unarmed Jewish lecturers, students, nurses, and doctors on their way to the Mount Scopus enclave in Jerusalem, the location of the Hadassah Hospital and Hebrew University. On April 13th, the convoy was ambushed. The Haganah escorts kept the attackers at bay, while Haganah headquarters was pleading with the British to intervene, as they stood by watching the fighting. As one observer put it, quote, British soldiers witnessed at close quarters university professors, doctors, and nurses being shot down and roasted alive in the burning vehicles without doing anything. End quote. 78 academics, doctors, nurses, students, and Haganah men were dead at the end of it all. It didn't end there, though. On May 13th, 2 days before the British mandate was completed, Arab irregulars broke into the Kfar Etzion settlement with villagers shouting, Deir Yassin, Deir Yassin. The Jewish defenders laid down their weapons and walked with their hands in the air toward the center of the village. They were mowed down by small arms fire. 120 people were killed on the spot, and 4 survived. On May 14, 1948, Ben-Gurion and other Jewish leaders gathered in the Tel Aviv Museum, where he read Israel's Declaration of Independence and announced the establishment of the state. Now, before turning to what comes next with the multiple invasions, we need to cover some background. Earlier, I'd mentioned that Grand Mufti Husseini had concerns about Arab armies invading Palestine. Let's talk about that for a second. So initially, the Arab attack plan for May 15th was coordinated. Everyone was working together with the same goal: Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The plan was set, but then at the last minute, things changed on May 14th. Lebanon, which had planned to send forces into the western Galilee in the north of the country, dropped out entirely. Jordan announced a change in its objectives, informing its allies it would seize the West Bank but had no intention of advancing north or west to the sea to cut Palestine in half. Its goal was a relatively quiet takeover of an area mostly under Arab control already, not an outright war with the Jews. As a result, Egypt and Syria had to scramble to adjust their plans. King Farouk of Egypt was convinced, as Husseini suspected, that this was a Hashemite land grab, and he'd be damned if he was going to let Jordan take the spotlight. The original Egyptian plan called for a concentrated push up the coast toward Tel Aviv, but Farouk ordered the army to split. One column would still move up the coast, while another pushed east into the Negev desert to seize more land and offset Jordanian gains. So basically from the get-go, things are already going off the rails. Behind the scenes, you have the Arab monarchs making chess moves against each other, while in public, officials like Azam Pasha, the Arab League's Secretary General, was making comments like, quote, "This will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre. It does not matter how many Jews there are, we will sweep them into the sea," end quote. These public declarations gave the appearance of unity and commitment to the Palestinians. In reality, no Arab leader gave legitimacy to Palestinian political aspirations. The real aim was territorial acquisition for themselves, not the creation of a Palestinian state under Husseini and the Arab Higher Committee. The Palestinians were sidelined both militarily and politically by their supposed allies. Jumping ahead a little in our timeline briefly, Benny Morris describes the relationship between Arab governments and Palestinian leadership as follows, quote, "A key feature of the Arabs' plans was the complete marginalization of the Palestinians. The remaining militia formations were either ignored or destined to serve as auxiliaries to the regular armies. This aptly reflected the political reality. The military defeats in April to May had rendered them insignificant." The Arab League through the first half of 1948 had consistently rejected Husseini's appeals to establish a government in exile. But the May 15th invasion, with Jordan's occupation of much of eastern Palestine, was to change the situation. Under strong pressure from Egypt, which feared complete Hashemite control over the Palestinians, the League Political Committee in mid-September authorized the establishment of a Palestinian government. On September 22nd, the Arab Higher Committee proclaimed the establishment in Egyptian-ruled Gaza of the All-Palestine Government, end quote. Morris adds, quote, "But it was all a farce. On September 30th, King Abdullah convened in Amman the rival First Palestinian Congress, which promptly denounced the Gaza government," end quote. In other words, Egypt and Jordan each propped up competing Palestinian governments, one in Gaza, one in the West Bank. Sound familiar? And this wasn't to empower the Palestinians, but to cloak their own land grabs in the language of Palestinian nationalism. The All-Palestine government in Gaza, Morris notes, quote, "maintained a paper existence as a subsection within the Arab League until 1959, when it was finally disbanded by Nasser," end quote. Nasser was the guy who took over Egypt in 1954 after a coup in 1952, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The point I'm trying to make here is that this was an absolute dumpster fire of political cloak and dagger that was being spearheaded by the Jordanians and the Egyptians under the guise of furthering the Palestinian cause at the time. Back to May 1948. The Arab armies invaded on the 15th. A day after, Ben-Gurion proclaimed Israel's independence. Jordan quickly occupied the West Bank, already mostly under Palestinian Arab control as it was. Egypt advanced from the south, pushing toward Tel Aviv before being stopped by the Haganah. Iraqi and Syrian forces invaded from the north, dug into defensive lines, and soon realized they couldn't reach Haifa as planned. We don't have enough time to get into every operation and battle after the invasion, but we'll focus on a couple highlights, including some Cooper comments on directly, but let's look at how he characterizes the invasion. He states, quote, "The operations from the Arab militaries were almost completely restricted to the operations within the portion of Palestine that had been partitioned by the UN to the Arab population. They avoided mounting operations within the Jewish zones almost completely, so the Israeli War of Independence, in other words, was not really a defensive war fought on Israeli soil against an invading enemy. The actual combat was fought almost entirely on territory allotted by the UN to the Palestinian Arabs. End quote. This isn't accurate. The invading armies in May 1948 aimed to strike at Haifa and Tel Aviv, neither of which were allocated to the Palestinian state under the UN plan. The objective was to destroy the Jewish state in the cradle. Israel's resistance forced the Arab armies to scale down the scope of their operations, but their initial intentions were clear. Additionally, a lot of fighting did in fact occur on land designated for the Jewish state. West Jerusalem nearly starved under siege, because roadways that fell squarely within the Jewish state per the 1947 UN partition plan were under the control of Arab irregulars and other forces. Major battles took place within Jewish-assigned territory, including at Ramat Rachel, a village south of Jerusalem that changed hands multiple times in brutal close combat before the Israelis secured it. On the coast, the Egyptians were stopped at Ashdod, firmly within the Jewish zone. Their advance into the Negev, which was largely allocated to the Jewish state as well, drove straight through territory assigned to Israel, and surrounded dozens of Jewish villages, cutting them off from resupply. So it's difficult to see how Cooper can claim otherwise. The maps from the period make it clear. Fighting was widespread across both Arab and Jewish-assigned areas. At the beginning of June, agreements were signed between Ben-Gurion and the leaders of the Irgun and Lehi, disbanding the smaller revisionist organizations and folding their forces into the Haganah's central command. Menachem Begin had previously chartered a ship filled with ammunition and supplies for the Irgun that was already on the way from France. The Irgun was being combined with the Haganah to build what would be called the Israel Defense Forces, but Begin wanted some of the supplies earmarked for Irgun units specifically. Ben-Gurion interpreted this as Begin potentially trying to make a move to retain his own independent military units and undermine the government's authority. Begin vehemently denied this, but Ben-Gurion didn't believe him, and so as the ship is docking and unloading weapons, a firefight broke out, with the Haganah and Irgun firing on each other briefly. The ship, named the Altalina, pulled up anchor and made its way to Tel Aviv, where Ben-Gurion ordered the Haganah to shell it. The transport caught fire right in front of the beaches and sunk in the shallows. Around 20 men in total died in the clashes, most of them with the Irgun. Begin, similarly to what he had done during the hunting season years previously, made it known that the Irgun can't respond. I mean, they could, but he forbade it. He took the punches because he knew that if a civil war erupted now, everything would be lost. And so the Irgun and Lehi, they kept their weapons holstered and were integrated into the Israel Defense Forces. You know, one of the things I wonder about Begin, and this is a bit of a sidetrack here, when the Jews lost Jerusalem to the Romans in 70 CE, they were fighting each other inside the city. They were killing each other because they were broken up into different factions and they were burning each other's food supplies. It's unlikely they would have been able to hold off the Romans in the end, but if they were working together and had the supplies to ride out a siege, maybe things would have gone differently. You have to wonder in these moments if Begin was reflecting on this in the 1940s. I feel like it must have at least crossed his mind. At the end of September 1948, Ben-Gurion and his cabinet are discussing what to do next. The Syrians and the Iraqis are pinned in the north. The two biggest threats are the Jordanians in the center and the Egyptians to the south. The Israelis don't know that the Jordanians aren't planning on pushing any further out from the West Bank for a drive on Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, so they consider both the Jordanians and the Egyptians to be in a threatening position. The Israeli cabinet meets and they discuss what the focus should be because they can only dedicate resources and manpower to one front effectively. Ben-Gurion takes the position that the IDF should go into the West Bank and kick the Jordanians out to remove them from the board. The cabinet puts the motion to a vote, and it fails 7-6. Some sources say it was 7-5, but either way it was very close, within a couple votes. There were a few reasons this failed. The United Kingdom had security guarantees in place with Jordan, which was essentially a British client state at the time. The cabinet thought that pushing back too hard against the Jordanians may encourage the British to act. The other issue at play during this cabinet meeting was the sensitivities surrounding Christian holy sites in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. With the vote failing, the decision was made to prioritize dealing with the Egyptians in the south. You have to remember at the time that the Jordanians controlled East Jerusalem, which is where the Old City is, which includes the Western Wall. So this decision hit Ben-Gurion pretty hard, and he would go on to say that this would cause lamentations for generations. He would live to see the situation change, though, in 1967 when the Israelis took control of the Old City and the rest of the West Bank from Jordan, but that's a story for another day. So with the Israelis able to focus on the Egyptians in the south, they take Beersheba from the Egyptians, push them out of the vast majority of the Negev, and sink the Egyptian flagship Amir Farouk off the coast of Gaza. The one other operation name I'm gonna mention, and this is because it's just so crazy, is Operation Horev. So after the Israelis had kicked the Egyptians out from most of the south, they were still in a pretty tight defensive posture in Gaza, and the Israelis didn't want to tackle this head-on. It would have been a bloodbath. So they come up with the idea of sweeping around Gaza and into the Sinai Peninsula to cut off the entire Egyptian army. It's basically a Middle Eastern take on the Schlieffen Plan when the Germans tried to outflank the French by pushing through Belgium, except this time it worked. So on December 28, 1948, the Israelis push into Egypt, and this is a big deal because now the IDF is crossing an international boundary with a country that has a defense pact in place with the British. Everyone starts telling the Israelis they have to stop here, and the British are threatening to get involved, and they're calling up President Truman saying they're going to lift the arms embargo and start supplying the Arabs. And Truman is calling up Ben-Gurion saying, you guys need to get back over that line. Everyone is freaking out. Meanwhile, the Israelis are marching across the Sinai and they eventually hit the coast and encircle the Egyptian army. At the beginning of January 1949, the Egyptians thought their entire army was about to be slaughtered. Under pressure from London, the Egyptians made it known that they were ready to enter into armistice talks with the Israelis. Ben-Gurion agreed to enter negotiations and withdrew Israeli forces across the international border. And with this, the dam had been broken, and subsequent armistice agreements were signed with all of the countries that had invaded Israel, except for Iraq, which technically may mean that Israel and Iraq are still at war, but I'll let the international law scholars sort that one out. All of the armistice agreements were concluded by mid-1949, with the last one being with Syria at the end of July. The guns went silent, for the time being. At the end of the war, roughly 700,000 Palestinians were displaced. Cooper refers to this with the following, quote, about somewhere between 700 to 800,000 Arabs were ethnically cleansed from Palestine, driven into the unoccupied West Bank, or into Gaza, or across the borders and quickly thrown together refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan, end quote. For Palestinians, this period came to be called al-Nakba, the catastrophe. The result of this would give rise to demands for the right of return, a demand that Palestinians or their descendants be allowed to return to the homes and villages of their ancestors. This demand later gained international resonance in UN General Assembly Resolution 194 of December of 1948, which called for refugees and those displaced by the war to be given the ability to return. Cooper doesn't really provide any context behind what happened here. It just isn't really addressed at all aside from it being framed as ethnic cleansing, so I would be doing a disservice to you if we didn't explore this a little bit. There were different phases to Palestinian flight and Palestinian expulsions, and so they need to be broken down. The first phase of Palestinian flight took place between December 1947 and March 1948, when the Haganah was still largely on the defensive. During this period, many from the upper and middle classes, perhaps as many as 75,000, left the cities and sent their families to the West Bank and surrounding Arab states. These departures weren't the result of expulsions, but a combination of factors that played a role. Some were unsettled by the bombing campaigns of the Irgun and Lehi, while others assumed any displacement would be temporary, much like the experience during the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, which eventually blew over. Another factor at play here were Palestinian political divisions. Families opposed to Husseini's Arab Higher Committee, remembering earlier assassinations and reprisals against rivals like the Nashashibis, feared what a Husseini-ruled Palestine might mean for them. The second phase began in the spring of 1948 as fighting intensified. Jewish forces shifted to the offensive under Plan D, which directly contributed to mass flight from both urban neighborhoods and rural villages, sometimes in response to attack and sometimes out of fear. Villages were sometimes depopulated through direct assaults or forced removals, especially in areas where armed resistance was encountered by the Haganah. In other cases, civilians fled out of fear on their own accord prior to the commencement of any hostilities in the area. By this point, the earlier departure of elites had sapped morale and created a pattern that everyday people followed. Flight often became contagious, spreading from one community to another. In some places, Arab commanders themselves ordered evacuations to clear ground for military purposes, though later in May, both Transjordan and the Arab Higher Committee began urging civilians to stay put, and in some cases punishment was threatened if these directives weren't adhered to. At the same time, the Haganah began moving to restrict large-scale returns in order to secure rear areas during the fighting. In June, the Israeli cabinet formally resolved to not allow mass refugee returns, citing both security concerns and the pressure to house new Jewish immigrants arriving in the country. Abandoned villages were dismantled or repurposed. Later stages of the war, in July and again in October to November of 1948, saw further displacement. Unlike earlier waves, these departures were less spontaneous. In contested areas, Israeli troops were more systematically inclined to expel populations, most famously in Lydda and Ramla, where tens of thousands marched east to the West Bank. By the end of the year, whole regions of the Galilee saw dramatic demographic changes. Ben-Gurion and other leaders did express a preference for a smaller Arab population in the new state, and while Israel never adopted a single written order for blanket expulsion, in practice the war created conditions where expulsions and flight reinforced one another to result in material population changes. In the years that followed, the refugees themselves rejected most attempts to resettle them in neighboring Arab countries, with Jordan being a notable exception and the only neighboring state to grant them citizenship. It should be noted that throughout all of this, there are some notable examples of Jews trying to get Arab populations to stay put. The most noteworthy example is Haifa. Haifa was home to the second largest Arab community in Palestine and had roughly a 50-50 population split of 70,000 Jews and the same number of Arabs. In April 1948, British troops withdrew from their positions between the Jewish and Arab neighborhoods, and firefights began to break out. On April 22nd, Arab community leaders were brought to the town hall to meet with Jewish representatives, including Haifa's mayor, Shabtai Levy, where terms between the two sides were ironed out. The deal stipulated that the Arabs in the city would surrender all of their military equipment and that the Arab population would maintain a future as equal and free citizens of Haifa, with Mayor Levy reinforcing this by stating that the two communities should continue to live in peace and friendship. Before the Arab delegation signed the terms, they requested a break. They then tried to get in touch with the Arab Higher Committee and potentially Arab League officials, but by all indications they weren't able to get in touch with anyone. When the Arab community leaders reassembled at the town hall that evening, they changed their tune completely. This is pulled from a report from Cyril Marriott, the British consul in Haifa, reporting to Ernest Bevin, the foreign secretary, back in London. He stated in the report, quote, that they were not in a position to sign the truce as they had no control over the Arab military elements in the town, and that in all sincerity they could not fulfill the terms of the truce, even if they were to sign. They then said as an alternative that the Arab population wished to evacuate Haifa, man, woman, and child. End quote. It's clear that without direction from the Arab Higher Committee, they were wary of agreeing to surrender to the Jews out of fear that they may be branded as traitors or collaborators, and so rather than agreeing to a truce, they chose to evacuate the city instead. This made no sense to Jewish and British officials, with Mayor Levy appealing passionately to the leaders and begging them to reconsider, but to no avail. Over the next 10 days, all but 5,000 Arab inhabitants of Haifa departed by naval and land convoys, with the Arab Higher Committee labeling those who remained as turncoats. When we talk about refugees in the Middle East, most people immediately think of the Palestinians, but there's another refugee story that's been largely overlooked. One involving nearly 1 million Jews who left or were forced from their homes in the aftermath of the 1948 war. In total, we're talking about roughly 800 to 900,000 people, a massive population displacement. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees formally recognized this twice, first in 1957 and again in 1967, acknowledging Jews from Arab countries as bona fide refugees under international law. Take Iraq, for example, home to one of the world's oldest Jewish communities stretching back some 2,500 years. Iraqi Jews were subjected to intensifying persecution after Israel's creation. Jews faced arrests, show trials, and executions. The most infamous case was Shafiq Eides, Iraq's wealthiest Jew who was falsely accused of supporting both Israel and the Communist Party. His assets were seized and he was hung publicly in September 1948, shocking the community. In 1950, the Iraqi parliament passed a denaturalization law, allowing Jews to renounce their citizenship and emigrate, but only if they left behind all their property while doing so. Within 2 years, the Israelis organized an airlift that brought about 120 to 130,000 Jews to Israel. By 1952, of a community that had once numbered over 130,000, barely 6,000 remained in Iraq. A similar story unfolded in Yemen, another community with more than 2,000 years of history. After a pogrom in December 1947 killed at least 80 Jews in Aden, conditions deteriorated further. Jews were harassed by authorities and prevented from emigrating freely. In response, Israel launched another airlift from 1949 to 1950, which brought 49,000 Yemeni Jews to Israel, essentially the entire community. Egypt's Jews, numbering some 75 to 80,000 before 1948, also suffered in the wake of the Arab-Israeli conflict. They were harassed by authorities and accused en masse of being Zionist sympathizers. The turning point came with the Suez Crisis of 1956 when Nasser's government expelled around 25,000 Jews, stripping many of them of citizenship, freezing their assets, and confiscating their property. From that point on, Jewish life in Egypt collapsed. Today, only a handful remain. These scenes were repeated in different forms across the Middle East and North Africa, in Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Morocco, and Tunisia. Together, they add up to one of the largest but least discussed refugee crises of the 20th century. From a population of nearly 1 million Jews across the Arab world, fewer than 15,000 remain today. With the end of hostilities, the Jordanians were in control of the West Bank, and the Egyptians maintained a military governorship over Gaza. That would be the status quo until 1967, when Egypt blockaded the Straits of Tiran, preventing Israeli shipping from reaching the southern port of Eilat. This initiated a cascade of events far beyond the scope of this episode. During those nearly 20 years, no attempt was made to turn that land over to a Palestinian state or to empower any Palestinian government in those territories. Husseini ended up being right on one thing. It was a land grab. As we move into the closing minutes of this sixth and last installment of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem, Cooper launches into a historical rapid-fire summary, covering major moments in just a sentence or two to catch the audience up to the present day. Really, each of these statements could be their own podcast episode. We're going to jump through a couple of these and expand on them. I'll warn you now, Cooper jumps around in the timeline, so it may feel jarring, but we'll work through it together. Cooper says, quote, "After everything that had happened, Jabotinsky and the revisionists were going to get the last laugh after all, because in 1977 Menachem Begin was elected Prime Minister of Israel." End quote. Begin, as you may recall, was the head of the Irgun and the revisionists before becoming Prime Minister in 1977. This election was the first time in Israeli history that a right-wing government came to power, and it was a major upset. Given Begin's past, you would have expected him to be a hardliner on issues involving those he fought against in 1948, but he shocked everyone with the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty in 1979, which, spoiler alert, gave the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt after Israel had taken it in 1967. Israel evacuated around 10,000 settlers from the area and for the first time embraced the principle of land for peace with its neighbors. This peace treaty is still in place today, in 2025. There's a lot Cooper skips over here, events worth discussing in podcast episodes in and of themselves. Events like the wars of 1967 and 1973, the war in Lebanon in the 1980s, the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, the Second Intifada in the early 2000s when suicide bombers targeted buses full of kids in Israeli cities, the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty in 1994, and so many other inflection points. But Cooper fast-forwards to 2005. He tells us, quote, "In 2005, the Likud Prime Minister Ariel Sharon ordered the evacuation of Jewish settlements from Gaza and placed that city in the south and the whole area under siege. Now, over 60% of Gaza's population is 14 years old or younger, and the Israelis literally have it surrounded by a wall with remote control machine guns dotting the top of the wall facing inward toward the inmates." End quote. The Bush administration in the early 2000s was pressuring the Palestinians to hold elections after the death of Yasser Arafat in 2004, who was the spiritual and political successor of Haj Amin al-Husseini. The elections took place in 2006 after, as Cooper highlights, Sharon pulled 8,000 Jewish settlers out of Gaza by force. Politically speaking, for Sharon, this was essentially repeating what Begin had done in the Sinai, and the outcome would have been positive for him either way. If the pullout from Gaza succeeded, he could claim he had exchanged land for the possibility of a broader peace deal with the Palestinians, and that Gaza was the first step. If it failed, Sharon and his party could say, look, we tried, we pulled out and we got hostility and violence in return. The elections were held in 2006, and Hamas won a plurality, with just over 44% securing a majority of seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council. This backfired on the Bush administration, leaving everyone with egg on their face. Today, in 2025, there are many ways to characterize Hamas, but I'll let Cooper's own words from 2016 do it for me. Quote, Hamas, the terrorist resistance group based out of Gaza, is basically a death cult, celebrates suicide bombers as martyrs of war. You know, when you can't win a fight, you start to celebrate losing, and so they celebrate suicide bombers as martyrs. End quote. And so with Hamas forming the government, the Israelis looked at these guys and their founding charter from 1988. Here are some quotes from that charter. I'm going to jump around within it, so for the record, these aren't all grouped together. Quote, Israel, Judaism, and Jews challenge Islam and the Muslim people. May the cowards never sleep. Our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious. It needs all sincere efforts. It is a step that inevitably should be followed by other steps. End quote. The document goes on to blame the Jews for the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution in Russia, and most of the revolutions of the world. It says that the Jews formed secret societies like the Freemasons and Rotary clubs, and that they were behind World War I. If you claim Jews were the reason most men over 40 need colonoscopies, it probably would have made it into the final cut of this thing. So Hamas came to power after launching rockets into Israel in the early 2000s. They initially promised to govern with Fatah, the other major Palestinian political party, but soon violence erupted in Gaza between the two factions. A modern-day Husseini versus Nashashibi blood bowl marked by gunfights, assassinations, and public executions followed. After Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, Israel imposed the blockade Cooper refers to. Given Hamas's rocket attacks, executions, and radical rhetoric, allowing them to freely import weapons didn't seem like a great idea. This was later validated by further violence, kidnappings, and infiltration tunnels dug into Israel to carry out attacks. All of this, of course, culminated on October 7, 2023, with Hamas's invasion into Israel from the Gaza Strip, in which nearly 1,200 Israelis were killed and over 250 were kidnapped. Of those killed, 379 were affiliated with Israel's security forces. As of now, 48 hostages are still being held by Hamas in Gaza. It isn't clear how many of them are still alive, but it seems that around 20 may be. As of the date of this recording, 66,000 people have been killed in Gaza. It isn't clear how many of those are combatants and affiliated with Hamas, and which ones are civilians. The Gaza Ministry of Health doesn't differentiate in its reporting between combatants and civilians. Cooper ends Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem with the following. These are the last lines in the finale. Quote, For any solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the Arab-Israeli conflict, or I guess now the Jewish-Muslim conflict, it's expanded to that. For any solution to even get off the ground, if there's going to be a solution, it's going to have to begin with the Israelis recognizing what they have done to the Palestinian people. With them saying, look, it was crazy back then, okay? We didn't know what else to do. We didn't have a home, and it was pogroms and then the Holocaust and everything else that was going on. And we were desperate and we just didn't know what else to do, but none of that was your fault and it shouldn't have landed on you, and we are sorry. We are sorry. And then by the time any of us, your people or my people, were born, this stuff was already happening. It had been happening, and then we were caught up in it. You were taught to hate us. We were taught to hate you. And then by the time we're teenagers, I'm being conscripted into the IDF, and you're being taught how to make a Molotov cocktail to throw at me. So can we work this out or what? All my Jewish and Israeli friends laugh when I bring that up, but I'm gonna keep waiting around for somebody else to come up with a better idea. End quote. This is really a fitting coup de grace. It has everything I would have expected to top us off. A contradiction, a simplification, tokenism. It really has it all. The contradiction is characterizing the history here as a Jewish-Muslim conflict. Back in episode 1, and I've harped on this throughout the series because I think it's just a total flattening of the complexity of this conflict. Back in episode 1, Cooper said, quote, "This was and always was a political conflict with definite causes and specific grievances." End quote. And there is a political dimension to the history here, but there's so much more to it, and religion plays a pivotal role. So to now have him in the last lines of the series doubling back on this is worth noting. The simplification comes from the call to action. If only Israelis apologize, then there would be peace. Back in the first installment, Cooper told us he wasn't going to try to convince us that one side is right or wrong here, and yet, finally, it feels like he's showing his cards and where he stands, something I think that's been transparent for some time. You know, I spent a lot of time thinking about how I wanted this first miniseries between us to end, and I didn't come up with a great plan for how to wrap this up, so I really just want to leave you with this. We started off this series talking about Herodotus and Thucydides, the fathers of modern history, how different their approaches were, and the legacy they each left us. Good history provides the context, it sweats the details, and it sources accurately. I don't have a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't know what the future holds or if peace is possible or whether this is truly intractable. What I do know is that it's a lot more complicated than Cooper portrays. I'd like to thank you for tuning in for the conclusion of this first miniseries, and I hope that as we explore the claims of other influencers and pop historians as well as other topics moving forward, that you'll join me as we continue to separate history from hysteria. That brings us to the end of this episode of Crackpot History. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, feel free to share it with someone that you think would get something out of it as well. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.